Tales for Dark Nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
So,
said Penny. She held the digital recorder out to the old man with the purple hair and tried to tuck away the goofy grin on her face.
Why don't you tell us about the first time you saw a fairy?
Gosh, man, I'll never forget it,
said the man. His name was Anton, and he stroked his long gray beard with one hand while he held the steering wheel with the other.
Heck, I was maybe 8 or 9, and I was out by myself, off in the woods somewhere. Kids went all over the place in those days, so I remember walking real far out somewhere, and I come across this place. It was beautiful, dark circle of trees, and right in the middle of them was this big old rock half sticking up out the ground. And I'm walking up, right? And I see this big pair of butterfly wings resting right on top of it. And so I start to think to myself, these wings were way too big for a regular butterfly. And I take another step closer. I tell you, I must have frightened it, because as soon as I do, and I swear on my life this is true, I see a tiny little person attached to those wings. Honest to goodness. And it just goes and flies off.
Huh. Wow. Well, that's something then,
said Penny.
Did you ever see it again, or anything like it?
Well, maybe. Blips and bits here and there. But let me tell you this. Sometimes I see things in the woods. Little things. Sticks arranged in certain ways. Berries and rocks laying in odd patterns. And I know it's them. And I guess it's like, I just know they've been there. I haven't seen one in the open like that since that time at the rock. But then again, I ain't been back there since then. It's a sacred place.
All right. Now, why don't you tell us quickly about the housing development that's going to be built near there?
Penny said.
Well, as you know, myself and the rest of the Fairy Friends Nature Preserve are protesting the Reeves Company housing development being built near the Stella Oaks woodland as of right now, seeing as how it's gonna upset the natural life near it. The flora and the fauna and the like, you know. All that building and construction and the noises is especially going to affect the fairies. And so that's why we're going out today, to get a picture of a fairy, to prove to those housing developers that fairies are real as morning sun, man, and that they deserve to be protected. The rest of the group begged me to come with, but I insisted it only be us 3. Myself, a journalist, and a photographer, and that's it. I don't want to frighten them with a whole gang of people, you know?
Yep,
Penny said.
just us 3. Right, Frederick? We love this kind of stuff.
Penny turned back to the stiff man holding the camera equipment in the back seat.
And we're pretty familiar with these kinds of situations too, right, Frederick? Remember when we did the story about the Bigfoot hunt up in Hartford last year? Or the Michael Jackson seance in Chicago?
Frederick itched his neck and looked to the side, clenching his jaw. Yeah, was all he said. Penny suppressed a chuckle.
So, you really think we'll see anything today?
She asked Anton.
Well, I certainly hope so. Why, just a little bit of evidence might make a huge difference, I believe. I'm on a course to blow some minds today, man.
Oh yeah, me too.
said Penny.
Either way, I think we're gonna have a great day of dragging our butts through the woods here. Which reminds me, I forgot to bring my bear mace, but I do have some bug spray here if you boys need it.
Oh, I'm afraid we can't use that, ma'am,
said Anton.
They don't like chemicals. Using that could lessen our chances of seeing anything. All those aerosols can really harsh their auric biomes.
Oh, alright, that's fine. I'll just leave it right here then, no problem. So, they don't like chemicals, huh? Guess that makes sense. Fred, did you know that?
Fred closed his eyes and sighed through his nose. No, he said.
Oh, you know what? One more thing.
Penny said into the recorder.
So, you remember the place you told me about that's called Sullen Rock? Is there any reason why it's named that? Seems a little ominous for a place that fairies would hang out at, don't you think?
Well, I guess so. But to be honest with you, ma'am, I couldn't really tell you. The only thing I really know about it is that the Native American tribes around here used to refer to it as such, and Sullen is a rough translation of its original name. Still couldn't tell you why, though. However, from what I've heard, is that they stayed far, far away from it.
Penny was silent, letting her eyes wander as she thought about this. Anton turned to her, his big eyes beaming from his thick Coke bottle glasses.
Like I said, though, it's a sacred place. Okay, everyone,
said Anton. His bandana was dripping with sweat, as were all three by this point.
Just a bit farther up now. And just as a precaution, we should probably keep our voices down just a little bit. Oh, and Fred, if you don't mind, I don't think we should be using flash photography.
Fred slapped another bug from his neck, almost dropping the camera bag he was holding. He looked up and gave the old man a sneer. Penny wiped the sweat from her brow. The trees were tall here and thick. They almost completely blocked out the sun, yet not enough to stop the heat or humidity. She took a drink from her water bottle, then fanned herself off with the notepad in her hand.
Great. Hey, are we almost there?
She said.
Yes, we're very close,
said Anton, making a shush motion.
All right now, stay behind me and keep your intent positive. Fairies can pick up on our sour gamma waves, so we need to maintain a diverse stream of consciousness while we're here.
They watched the old man peel back bushes and tree leaves to reveal a slab of rough rock stuck halfway out of the ground. It wasn't as big as she had pictured it, but there was a sort of odd curvature about it, like a crescent shape sticking out of a smooth, lopsided base. A patch of pale sunlight lit it up, and the whole thing stood out amongst the darkness of the trees like a hangnail on a thumb.
Oh my,
Anton said.
It's a little different than I remember it.
Get a picture of that,
Penny said. Frederick nodded and took a quick snap.
Okay, now, we need to tread lightly. This is their spiritual nexus. Now, hold on just a moment. I have a gift. It's a something of an offering.
Somewhere within the trees, Penny heard a branch snap and her eyes shot all around her. She put a hand on her beating heart, then turned back to Anton.
Wait, what's an offering? What are you going to do?
Oh, it's nothing much. It's just a little thing that a Scottish Failmancer taught me for making allies within the spirits of the Everwilds. Excuse me, I just have to get the stuff out of my pack here. 1 second. You'll see.
Anton reached in his backpack and pulled out an ornate little teacup with a gold rim, which he gently placed on the flat of the rock. Then he pulled out a thermos with a tea bag sticking out of the side and poured a little bit of hot tea in the cup. Penny could smell honey and cinnamon from the warm drink. She nudged Frederick and he snapped a picture.
Okay,
said Anton.
Now, there's that, and one more thing. They like sweet cakes, I'm told. So I got just a little thing here.
Anton reached in the pack and produced a cellophane package of chocolate chip cookies. Not just regular chocolate chip cookies either, but bright purple ones that had sparkly rainbow sprinkles littered about within them. He gently laid one out next to the tea and dusted the crumbs off of his fingers. Penny held back a snicker and nudged Frederick.
All right now, if you'll bear with me, I'm going to read a quick charge.
Anton stood up straight, put his hand on his heart, and cleared his throat.
Magic be quick, magic be free. A friend of the fairies I wish to be.
He accentuated that last part with his thumb and forefingers together, swaying his hands like a symphony conductor. Penny and Frederick were both holding a smile now.
All right,
said Anton, turning back to them.
Now, I don't know if that'll make 'em come running per se, but it's getting the line of communication open. I figure if we wait here for about another 7 hours or so, we're bound to see something. Also, if that doesn't work, I know some rhythmic dancing and chanting we can do to... Look,
said Penny, pointing behind him. Anton turned around. The three of them could see a big pair of brightly colored butterfly wings and a small head sticking out from behind them. There on the rock sat a little creature with its back turned, and they could hear the teeny bites it took as it snacked on the sweet, bright cookie. Face agog, Anton lifted up his glasses and then dropped them back on.
Oh my goodness,
he whispered. Penny and Frederick's mouths were wide open, then looked at each other. Frederick frantically snapped the camera at it. Anton turned back to them and pointed to it, smiling and mouthing the word see, then mouthed the word watch.
Hey, hello,
he said gently to the vivid little creature snacking on the cookie.
Hello, little forest sprite. My name is Anton, and these are peaceful people from the world of news information. We are simple outliers of the woods, here to make friends. Will you allow us to be your friend, little one?
The creature stopped gnawing at its cookie and had turned around. When it did, the smiles dropped down from their faces. What the three of them saw was not what one would think of a traditional fairy with dainty features, a sparkly tunic, and a pair of cute pointy-toed shoes. This creature looked more like a purple, brightly colored skeleton, with black eyes that sunk in its skull. It had skin that stretched over a greasy, bony little body that had ornate butterfly wings attached to it. The creature did not have lips, and instead had 2 rows of jagged, crooked teeth that snapped together. Anton pulled his hand back once the creature screeched, snarled, and snapped at him. Penny grabbed out to Anton's arm, and the two looked at each other, now with frozen hearts and stone faces. Anton steeled himself, and then forced a smile.
Okay, it's all right, little one. We're just here to make friends. You like that treat? I brought it specially for you.
The creature grasped its cookie with one skinny little arm and slashed up at him with a tiny hand that bore sharp little dirty claws similar to a cat's, as if the man were going to take it from him. Anton twitched himself away from the thing, but then cautiously reached his hand out towards it again.
No,
he said.
I don't want your cookie. I want to be a friend. Friend. It's okay. You can trust me. Anton, I don't know if that's a good idea,
Penny said.
No,
said Anton.
It's fine. Look.
Still holding on to its cookie, the little skeleton fairy sniffed at him, screeched, snapped its teeth, and sniffed at him again. With a slight bit of hesitation, it put down the cookie and little by little made its way to Anton's hand as it moved in erratic jerking motions. Then it leapt up from the rock onto Anton's arm, where it dug its claws in his flesh to make it up to his shoulders. Anton winced from the pain but remained steady. Penny and Frederick stood stiff, watching.
Ah, you see?
Anton said, pointing at the tiny creature on his shoulder. Anton was beginning to bleed a little. The little skeleton grabbed at his face and felt his features. Then, his clawed hands found his glasses. It threw them to the ground. Anton forced a chuckle out of his face and said,
I guess we don't need those, right?
He glanced over to Frederick and made a motion to take a picture. Frederick swallowed, then gave the camera a snap.
Anton?
Said Penny, swallowing.
I think maybe this is probably enough.
Anton was about to speak, but his words were cut off when the little skeleton fairy, now with the grip of Anton's hair in his hands, lifted its head high and screamed into the forest air. Anton shuddered at the sound of it in his ear and shut his eyes tight.
Well, that was quite loud, wasn't it?
He said, shuddering. Then from the darkness of the trees, 3 other skeleton fairies flew in and attached themselves to Anton. A pink one, a green one, and 2 pale orange ones, all with the exact same look as their purple brother, with the stretched out skin and the sunken-in eyes. They crawled around him, picking at his flesh and clothes with their claws.
Oh, look,
said Anton, visibly shaken now.
Friends, see, it's all right. We're just getting to know each other.
Anton punctuated this statement with a grimace as one orange fairy sunk its crooked yellow teeth into the leg of his jeans and bit him. Anton tried to brush its head away with a gentle stroke. Then it craned its head up and bit him on the finger. As soon as this happened, the other creatures joined in, as they picked, bit, and slashed into him more and more. Penny's face became pale, and a cool spread of fear flooded across her body.
It's okay. It's all right,
Anton kept repeating. A green one bit into his earlobe, and Anton grit his teeth, suppressing a scream.
All right,
he said.
Let's just get you off of there.
He gripped the skeleton fairy's body in his big hand and pulled it away from his earlobe. It held on like a dog with a piece of meat. He gave it a quick, sharp tug, and his entire earlobe came off inside the fairy's crooked little jaw. Anton let it go, and it zipped into the air. It landed on a nearby branch where it tugged at the fleshy piece of ear in its teeth and then spit it out onto the dirt. Then dove back down onto Anton's face.
Oh my God,
said Penny. The more Anton struggled against the creatures, the more they became excited and frenzied. All Penny and Frederick could do was sit and watch. Bleeding and picked at all over, Anton repeated,
"It's all right. It's okay."
over and over again. An orange one crawled across his legs and sunk its teeth into his hamstring. He dropped to his knees and tried to hold on to the bleeding wound on his neck as one was forcing its tiny skull head into the open wound. The purple one was fondling its claws on his eye socket, while more fairies flew from the trees, crawling about on him, biting and scratching. Tears rolled down from his eyes, which only stung the scratches and cuts on his face. Panting through clenched teeth, a spark faded from Anton's eyes.
You should probably get away from here,"
he said to Penny and Frederick, trembling. Then he quivered and shook, and finally allowed himself to let loose a wild scream. Reacting to the sound of his pain, the little fairies fluttered around in a frenzy, gnawing at him like a pack of wild dogs, biting, clawing, scratching, licking blood and chewing flesh right off his bones, bit by teeny tiny little bit.
"Come on,
Penny whispered, grabbing a handful of Frederick's shirt.
move back slowly. Don't make any quick moves."
She and Frederick moved backwards step by step, unable to tear their eyes away from what the little creatures were doing to Anton as he howled himself to death. Behind them, they could feel and hear the flapping and fluttering of wings, and they were so close. One landed on Penny's hoodie, and she clenched all her muscles as she saw it, trying to remain steady. It looked up at her and shrieked right in her face. Two landed on Frederick, and he jumped when he felt them. "Fuck!" he yelled, and before Penny could stop him, he had done something brash. He grabbed one of the little fairies in his hand and crushed its body like a beer can. Its bones snapped like hard twigs, and its black, beady eyes popped out of its skull head. Then it felt like time had slowed down as Frederick threw the tiny broken body at the rock in the center of the trees, where it bounced off it and fell onto the dirt. All the fairies had stopped right where they were, and black silence filled the air. In unison, the fairies lifted their deathly faces from wherever they were at and screamed in a horrendous high-pitched cacophony. Frederick had clearly pushed the boundary, and maybe just a step further when the dead fairy was besmirched on their sacred rock. "Go!" shouted Frederick, pushing Penny back. Before she had a chance to even assess the situation, the fairies all swooped into the sky like a plague of locusts and rained down on Frederick. "Go!" Frederick tried to shout again as the fairies reached their claws into his open mouth, clawing at the insides of his flesh. Penny turned herself around and ran as fast as she could down the hills of the forest, heart thudding in her chest. Frederick's screams floated in and out of the trees as she ran, while she gulped in panicked breaths of air. While most stayed behind, a few had followed her to the car and scratched at her as she ran. Their claws were like prickly little barbs and cut deep. Penny yelped as one tried to dig into her left eye. She ripped it away from her face and threw it aside before getting into the car and slamming the door shut. Anton had left his keys in the dash console. Penny snatched them up and started the car. 3 fairies perched themselves on the windshield and scratched at the glass. A yellow one hooked itself to the rearview mirror and tried to bash at the car window with its brittle forehead. Penny floored the gas out from the dirt trail. She found her way out to the main road amongst the trees. She gripped the wheel tight. "God damn it," she yelled. She reached into her jeans and pulled out her digital recorder, then slammed it into the dash over and over, swearing until it was broken. Then she threw the pieces behind her. When she had finally reached the main road and the fairies were no longer stuck to the hood, she pulled over, car hanging halfway into the road. She crumpled up to her side and buried her face in her hands. An indistinct clamor of clicks and hoots echoed in the distance. They sounded like the shrill hoots and screams of excited zoo monkeys, but she could immediately recognize the rusty inflection in their voices. They were coming up from somewhere above her. She leaned over in the seat to get a look up, and when she did, she felt a heavy thump on the car hood. A bloody, near-skeletonized corpse of a man had been dropped on the car and looked back at her with one eye sticking out of his skull. It was Frederick, and she knew it immediately. Eyes shut tight, she put her head down and shot the car in reverse, letting the body fall to the ground. When she opened her eyes once again, she could see the chaotic, flickering mass of colorful wings and brittle bodies wisp around in the rearview mirror. She spun the car around and hit the gas. Very soon, she felt the thumps against the car as the fairies threw their stick bodies up against it, and within a handful of seconds, the car was almost completely covered with fairies. She swerved to the left and to the right to shake them off, and somehow they managed to hold on and only accumulate. She heard a scrapping sound coming from the dash. Trying to focus on the road through the mass of tiny colorful bodies, she hit the top of the dash with the palm of her hand over and over to subdue the sound. And then she noticed colorful, gaunt little arms sticking out of the air conditioning vents. She reached up and tried to bat them away, but the little arms only became more furious. She let out guttural yells from her throat and then brought the car to a screeching halt in the middle of the road. She buried her face in her hands again and swayed back and forth, letting the sounds of their teeth and claws against metal and glass burrow into her ears. Then she noticed something sitting in front of her in the cup holder on the console. She picked up the can, clicked it open, aimed it at the air vent, and gave it a quick spray. The creatures inside hissed when the blast hit their faces, and she thought she could even hear sneezing. She thought about something, then looked around the car. Sitting in a door compartment was an old plastic lighter next to a half-smoked joint. She picked the lighter up, flicked it a couple of times to get a flame going, then aimed the can to the vent. A blast of fire hit the vent, and she could hear the fairy screaming inside. The scratching was now going back the other way. She blasted fire down the vent again and again, and let out a crazed laugh as she could hear them skittering and scraping their way out. She caught her breath and looked around at the bony fairies assaulting the car over and over again. She shut her eyes and sighed. Her body tensed up as she reached for the door handle and pulled it open with a hard yank. Fairies scrambled into the vehicle, and Penny greeted them with a hot blast of aerosol flames. Their wings quickly caught fire and spread just as easy. The first pack of fairies who caught the blaze rushed out of the car, flying in every direction, howling in agony as they burned. The ones that didn't catch flames flew back, snapping and screeching to her with their rusty little cries, raking out at the empty air before them in her direction. Penny rolled herself out of the car, blasting clouds of fire every which way. Whenever one would catch fire, it would make a frantic zip into the air and then burn out mid-flight. Groups of 3 or 4 would be lit up at a time. As the fairies burned up in clusters, others flew off in a frenzy one by one. They shouted and screeched as they flew off as to curse her, until finally, any fairy that hadn't caught a flaming death had disappeared far into the trees. Penny dropped the can, and it fell to the ground with a clink. She struggled to catch her breath while a trickle of blood poured out of the side of her face and landed on the hot pavement. She looked up into the sky, and within a matter of seconds the whole forest was calm and quiet, as if nothing had ever happened. With an elbow hanging outside of the car window as he drove, State Trooper Jim Matthews itched his mustache, then cleared his throat.
Reckon I ain't seen any of them fairy weirdos in a couple days. They were out here protesting every day, and now nothing. Wonder what happened.
Ain't no one heard from that big fella from what I hear, said Trooper William Friskins as he clicked around on a handheld video game from the passenger seat. Or that girl from the newspaper and her photographer. They were all together on some kind of fairy hunt last I heard. Maybe they found something.
Maybe,
said Trooper Matthews. He slowed down the car as something caught his eye in the thick of the woods.
Say, that girl from the newspaper, Penny Avenue was her name, right? She was the one who interviewed us last year when those kids were doing those Mothman pranks, right?
Yeah. Why? Said Friskins.
'Cause I'll about wager that's her dumping gasoline all over the forest floor right now.
Friskins put down his game and saw what his partner was looking at. Matthews stopped the car and they got out together, each with a hand on the butt of their guns.
Penny! Penny Avenue? Hey, excuse me,
shouted Matthews.
That's an awful lot of gas you got there. I don't know what you got planned, but it's looking like a bad idea.
No,
she shouted.
Get away from here.
Penny hid the plastic lighter in her hand.
It's not safe. You don't know what's happened. Let me do what I need to do.
All right, Penny, said Friskins. Let's just calm down now. You look a little scrapped up. Why don't you stop and tell us what's going on?
No,
said Penny.
You won't understand. It's these things. They'll kill you. They'll kill everyone. I can't let you stop me.
Penny spun around back towards the officers and started to flick at the lighter. The officers yelled to her, but she ignored them. When she got a flame going, she bent down to light the trail of gasoline.
What is she doing?
Said Matthews. I don't know. I think she's got a... Oh, God! No, Penny! The officer shouted at her, but his words fell on blank ears. She couldn't hear him, and she most certainly couldn't hear the 2 shots that went into her back that he fired from his gun. Time slowed down to a crawl as Penny fumbled to get the fire going. She felt her eyes roll into the back of her head, and a wave of numbness spilled all throughout her. The lighter flopped out of her hand as she held the hole in her torso, bleeding out on the forest floor in a stench of gasoline. Oh my God, Friskins said, shaking, holding the gun out in front of him. I just couldn't let her do it. The damage would have been awful. Matthews took his hat off and gently lowered Trooper Friskins' gun down for him. It's all right, just calm down. It's over now, Matthews said. He shook his head. I know it's hard, but you weren't exactly wrong there. Who knows how much life you just saved from a fiery blaze just now? Hold on, said Friskins. You hear that? Beyond the tree line, a chorus of cruel, teeny laughter filled the forest edge, and then blew away with the wind.
One. Dump the fucking tiles out on the table, boy, Billy John Cater said gruffly to his son of only 14 years old, who sat shaking in the chair with fear. Billy J had just celebrated, if that's what it could be called, his birthday only 2 weeks earlier. He lost his mother and the only ally in his hell-filled world mere hours ago. Her illness came on fast and strong. 2 weeks ago, she had looked tired and hacked and coughed a little more, but she had been feeling well enough to help him blow his candles out on the package of his favorite vanilla Hostess zingers she had put out on the table for him after school. His daddy's still working in the shop. Now, she was nothing more than a memory, and just when he had needed her most. She never was the pretty picture of the perfect mother, not that Billy J would have known any difference, but she was the only buffer between a heartless, wicked man and him. Billy J was the only good thing his mother ever accomplished, and she told him that a couple of times lately. And now, she was gone. A scared and empty little boy now sat nervously at the kitchen table, the place where he was already far too familiar with the mason jar and the harsh punishments it delivered. His world growing up was always full of dread and anxiety for as far back as he could recollect. He didn't understand why that damn jar was on the table, but he knew better than to question his daddy about it. But then sometimes a child don't know no better than to tempt his own fate. And there it was, staring him down like a rabid dog, visually snarling at him and beckoning to question why. Why? What? I mean, why? He stuttered and tried to ask his father. His words would come out broken and made him stumble even more. I don't know why. I ain't... The harsh man who sat across from him, still wearing his usual dirty gray trousers and grease-covered wife-beater t-shirt he always wore, began to answer back in his usual loud and angered tone. Don't you do it, you little fucker. Don't dare to question me, boy. But Mama's gone. I ain't done nothing to deserve no judgment today. I've been good. His father's eyes boiled with bloodshot red sternness. It easily cut deep and quick to the bone. Young Billy J couldn't imagine those eyes being from anything other than the devil himself. He had just spent hours crying in his bedroom since getting the devastating news of his mama's passing. His only refuge underneath his bed, curled up tight and wrapped in whimpers until his daddy yelled for him to get his ass to the kitchen. His father was no crier. Billy had never seen a situation where that son of a bitch ever shed a tear. Mama did, though. All the time. Seemed she was always smoking cigarettes and crying quietly to herself, muttering under her breath while always painstakingly trying to satisfy every demand his daddy had. It made no matter what it was, or how big or small. "Billy J," she'd whisper, "keeping your daddy happy is like transporting nitroglycerin across a mile of washed-out road." She'd stop about every sentence and cough a couple of times before continuing. "Honey, it's almost impossible to do without ending in a loud explosion followed by chaos and pain." She'd always touch the hair that hung over his eyes, the only sign of a mother's love he ever felt. "You'd be best to keep to yourself, son. Don't throw gasoline on his fire. Be sure to be there before he finishes calling you. Otherwise, he'll rain down hell's fury right on top of you." Billy J knew those words rang no truer. He had the scars to show it, physical and mental. Just before his daddy yelled to get in the kitchen, he was thinking about how his mama finally escaped the bastard's hold over her. But then, he was all alone with him now. The thought petrified him. No way could he stay and survive without his mama. "I'd rather get sick and die like she did. At least she finally got grace." This was the thought racing through his mind as he sat awaiting whatever was going to happen. "Don't you question me, little fucktard. Dump the fucking tiles out on a table like I done said, you little waste of a good time." Billy J didn't understand. It didn't make sense. It was an all-new way of playing the judgment game. He hated his daddy's jar his entire life, all 14 years of it, but it was always played the same way. The mason jar always put fear in him. The mere sight of it made his stomach bind up tight into twisting knots that sent a harsh burn up his chest to his throat. Somehow, Billy J suspected tonight would be much different. Even worse with Mama gone. He heard it in Daddy's voice. He could damn near smell it in the air, hovering above like soured milk, making it hard to breathe without retching. He wondered if he might just be joining his mama sooner than he had imagined. Did Daddy have it inside him to kill me? He wondered. The tension pierced deep inside, and its sting lingered around him. His daddy's eyes screamed a loathing loud and clear thunder through the hollow silence they held. He knew his daddy hated him. He made him feel worthless every day of his life. Billy J slowly reached for the jar. It was almost too big for his grip. He'd never been allowed to touch it, so the slickness of the glass made him extra nervous, afraid he might drop it. He carefully tipped it to its side and watched his different possible fates spill out onto the dirty tabletop. Some landed upside down where the black-lettered punishments remained hidden. Others sat boldly displaying their harshness in coal-black ink, easily seen with dread. Dunk, slap, and then one caught his attention. The tile that always seemed to elude him. Grace. Afraid to lift his face and meet his daddy's calloused, hardened stare, not knowing what to expect from this break in the way the game was normally played. His heart pumped inside his chest hard. He was certain the sound could be heard as loud as a freight train blasting its horn, announcing its arrival into town. He also knew his daddy enjoyed watching the panic in his eyes. 2. Pick up the Grace tile and hand it over to me, boy. We won't be needing it tonight. Those words alone spoke in volume that he just lost his only saving chance. Even at his young age, he realized life changed in this specific moment. Not only was his mama lost, but any shot at Grace disappeared along with her. In fact, boy, he continued, as his son nervously placed the Grace tile within his black, grease-stained palm, calloused and tattooed with open sores from the vehicles he worked each day. Grace is now banned forever from this house, dead and gone, just like your lying mama. Billy John began to scoot his chair back from the table. Its legs dragged heavy and bellowed out screams against the wooden floor, matching the sharpness of Billy J's internal cries of anguish from the pain he knew would soon be announced to him. He dared to break the rule once more. The rule his mama warned him of, but he opened his mouth. Why, Daddy? What did I do wrong? Is it 'cause I cry for my mama who just died? He begged. That's all I can think of that I did. I already miss her bad. Miss her? You killed her slow, boy. From the day you ripped her lady parts up, entering this world ass backwards. And you've been choking the life out of her ever since. He guffawed a wicked chortle which burned as it rang loudly in his ears. You were never wanted, boy. And you've been nothing but a goddamn nuisance ever since. Mama told me she loved me and she hated you. I didn't kill her. You said it was lung cancer from the cigarettes. His tear-filled eyes began to sting, but he insisted to remain defiant and hold strong with his resolve. If anybody killed her, it's you. She was always scared of you. You fucker. Maybe that's what killed her? The monster inside you? The one that makes you drink and yell and hit? Billy John finished scooting out of his chair by flinging it backwards through the air until it slammed loudly into the oven. Get over here, you little bastard. He opened his hand that held the Grace tile. It stared back at him as boldly as his rebelling son did. That angered him even more, causing him to toss it into the trash piled up on the floor. You're gonna pay for those sharp words you think you're man enough to fucking use? There won't ever be Grace in this house again. Never. You hear me clear about that, boy? You're gonna fucking regret believing you're man enough to talk shit to me. I'm the fucking judge here. I'm the goddamn hangman when need be, and that need be coming on stronger than a hurricane, boy. The veins in his temples bulged and his normally pasty white skin became beet red with vile anger. Billy J quickly realized he had goaded his daddy beyond a point he had ever crossed. It scared him knowing the pain and chaos that was going to follow from the nitroglycerin exploding. But he knew he had been judged for the very last time by the son of a bitch he called Daddy. There never was any goddamn Grace in this house, you fuck. I wish it was you that was dead, not my mama. You never deserved her, and I know she's glad as hell she's gone away from you. A closed fist flew from nowhere and contacted Billy J's left side of his face with an instant thunderous explosion of hurt. It sent him staggering backwards as he stumbled from the chair to the floor. His head smacked hard against the wall and then onto the hardwood flooring as his blurred vision went instantly dark and dead quiet. 3. His ears throbbed and rang. Billy J's eyelids barely parted, allowing him to see the bourbon bottle gripped in his daddy's hand. He wasn't sure exactly where he was or what had happened. His temples pounded. The left side of his face felt numb, yet the skin burned like fire. His vision lacked clarity when he attempted to coyly survey the surroundings. His eyelids mere slits and he kept his head perfectly still. He shivered. His skin was cold, wet, and felt shriveled. After squinting a little more to bring his awareness closer into focus, he realized it was the bathroom. He was in the tub, his father sitting on the stool across from him. Terror surrounded him instantly like the frigid water he was lying in. The tile that spelled out dunk came instantly into his consciousness. Had that tile spilled out onto the table tonight? Remembering the last time it happened, his panicked flailing arms fighting to breathe in air, but only water rushing into his lungs. He had been dunked so many times in his past it brought the worst fears and memories ever imagined. It was far worse than any of the other punishments that were etched onto the small square wooden tiles Daddy's jar held. How'd I end up here? He questioned himself. He quietly attempted some recollection. Bits and pieces seemed to be just out of his reach, yet he was ever so careful to keep the fact he was now awake concealed. He knew one thing for sure, and he repeated it to himself internally over and over. Run away. As soon as the bastard drank enough whiskey to close his eyes, he would quietly leave. Run away. Tonight. He held no clue where he would go, but he would put one foot in front of the other without question and run, never looking back. He knew he had awoken the devil today, and there would be no bedding him back down ever again. He'd have to either kill it or sneak off in the dark. At 14, he held no knowledge on how to kill someone, nor the knowledge if he could really follow through should he conjure up a way to do it. His daddy was strong. His daddy drank the devil's blood every night and day. No doubt they were one and the same with powers unbeatable. For now, he just needed to fight the shivers and remain still as a statue like he were dead. He mustn't let Daddy know he was awake. Wait him out. Let him keep drinking from that damned bottle. Please keep drinking, he begged inside his heart and soul. In an instant, he wished he hadn't let the thought about his mama being gone in his head again. It was that one sniffle he let slip that gave him up. It garbled up to the surface of the cold bathwater and drew the devil's attention away from the whiskey and back to his evil agenda. In his peripheral vision, his eye that wasn't swollen closed saw the arm swoop down fast on him, black greasy fingers opening wider as they grabbed at his hairline and jerked him under. 4. Billy J's arms and legs flailed wildly as water doused the walls and floor from his kicking and thrashing. His daddy's grip held firm, squeezing his head down tight against the iron tub's porcelain bottom. He desperately needed to draw a deep breath, but he knew what would happen. Instead, cold water would fill his throat and chest cavity, not the oxygen his lungs screamed for. He continued to hold his breath and fight until he was about to surrender and suck in as hard as he could, hoping for the air his body craved would be there, but knowing it wouldn't. Daddy's hand gripped his hair and held him down, then suddenly reversed the action. Billy J was jerked to the surface just in time to inhale one quick coughing breath mixed with heavy droplets of choking water. The young boy's mind prepared for another plunge. He had been here before. The procedure drilled into memory. His punishment wasn't over yet. Two things now fought for his brain's attention and control. Survival first, and then revenge. He wanted to kill the fucker responsible for his horrendous torture. He knew it for sure. He barely got a half breath before his head was shoved back under, eyes still open wide, now blurred from the rush of cold stinging water that flooded them. The large murky silhouette hovered above him and created a fuzzy canvas of motion just above the water's surface as his head lashed back and forth, splashing waves of turmoil. He frantically searched for another life-saving gulp of air, but the monster continued his wrath of towering over him. It held him under with the strength of what was certainly a creature from the deepest bowels of hell. After the third or fourth repeated action, the hand gripping his hair threw his head back into the water, but this time there was no pressure to hold him under. Left for dead, it was over for now. The figure got up from his knees and loudly muttered, "That's what you get for killing my housekeeper, cook, and piece of ass, boy. Now you got fend for yourself like a real man." And he left the room, likely in search for his goddamned whiskey bottle he loved so much. The only damn thing he ever loved. Billy J lay motionless, almost lifeless, shivering and spent. He desperately gasped deep breaths and sputtered water from his mouth. Seems Mama would have to wait to meet up with him again, though. He had somehow survived his daddy's fury once more. Too afraid to climb out of the tub and dry off, he instead waited to make sure the devil was passed out. It was cold, and he softly cried ice-cool tears. They rained continually down his cheeks. Light muddled sobs echoed around the frigid iron and porcelain sides of the tub, hovering just above the water's surface, reverberating atop the now placid calm. The aftermath of the assault. Now came the planning stage of running. 5. Billy J held no clue how long he had been lying in the tub. He did finally risk pulling the plug, hoping it would drain its contents without sound. He grabbed a wet towel from the floor and pulled it over his still water-soaked clothes, wrapped himself tightly into a cocoon, and nestled in. Billy J searched for any warmth he could find, his ears perked and tuned in for constant guard of any sounds that may stir outside the closed door. He was trapped like a frightened, wounded rabbit in a cage. Freedom was just outside the closed door and around the corner. But where was the fox, and could he avoid him on the way out? He knew he needed to grab things before sneaking away. He wasn't ever coming back again. He knew that much for sure. And his daddy was right. He would be fending for himself from now on. Billy's mind drifted to a time his mama had taken him to a matinee movie several years back. It was the only special day he could remember having. Not certain why it came to him now, but the memory somehow reassured him. My Side of the Mountain was the title. It was about a young boy who took off on his own and lived up in the mountains all by himself. He survived. Billy J smiled, but it was mixed with worried apprehension. I could survive too, couldn't I? He wondered. He knew there was no chance of living if he stayed. He couldn't. He wouldn't last another thrashing. Never another flogging. It felt like hours before Billy mustered up enough bravery to crawl out from the tub and attempt to peek outside. He twisted the knob ever so carefully. The frightened and shivering boy feared each click of the door handle mechanism, seeming thunderous enough to wake the beast. Maybe he was still so medicated by the brown liquid from attempting to erase the guilt from his torturous actions. Billy J guffawed, knowing his daddy held no form of any guilt at all. He cautiously pushed the door open, then tiptoed carefully down the hallway, avoiding all the squeaky spots past the messy living room. He spied an empty bottle tipped on its side across the coffee table, lying beside his mama's ashtray, still sitting piled up high with cigarette butts. Another near-empty bottle was barely clutched in his daddy's hand. It hovered just above the messy floor below the couch he was passed out on. Light snores filled the room with no visible movement from the body sprawled out across the filthy stained cushions. Cautiously, he continued to walk down the hallway, still stepping over and around the boards that may give his movements up. He made it to his room, and after entering, he quickly and silently opened and shut drawers, pulling out the things he thought he would need to make it on his own. In his young, foggy mind, he was grasping at straws. He held no clue of what the future would bring him or just what he would need to take to face such an obstacle. Money would be needed for sure, and he did know where the cookie jar that held his daddy's precious stash was. He would retrieve its contents on the way out. He'd also take every fucking bit of it too. He owed that son of a bitch nothing. Billy J stuffed clothes into his backpack, grabbed his pocket knife his mama had recently given him, causing another tear from thinking about her. He shoved the thought away as he glanced one more time around, looking for anything he was forgetting. There was nothing left but bad memories in this room now. It would be easy to leave and never look back. Knowing the path all too well, he silently tiptoed back down the hallway, avoiding the noisy floorboards by carefully weaving back and forth between the walls. He knew each one well. He had done it a million times before. Upon reaching the kitchen entryway, he quickly spied the cookie jar on the top shelf. After setting his backpack down, he lifted a chair and carried it over to the counter, then tacitly placed it beside the cupboard. A couple of careful steps up, both hands methodically clasped the heavy jar tightly within his grip before kneeling and placing it quietly down on the counter. He took a huge breath after accomplishing the task without mishap, and then pulled the lid from the jar and looked in. There it was, the roll of bills he had seen his daddy stuff inside every time a customer paid him for a car repair. It was thick and had a $20 bill on the top that wrapped around all the others and was rubber banded into a bundle. It was a fortune for sure. There was something else resting in a clump next to the roll. It was soft, and as he attempted to lift it up, he found it heavy as it jingled. He realized it was a sock when he continued to lift it out. The fabric stretched from the weight of what was hidden inside. After retrieving it and placing it beside the jar on the countertop, the fabric ballooned out with more clinks and clatter. He immediately knew what was inside before pulling the opening wide enough to see its contents. It was change, dimes and nickels mixed. By its weight, it must be several more dollars inside, he thought. He knew he should just take the cash, abandon the lid and jar on the counter and leave. But that's not what he did. He knew his mama hated her kitchen being a mess, even though Daddy never put anything back and trashed every corner of the house. Out of habit of trying to please her, he set the money roll down and maneuvered the lid over the jar, nestling it almost back into position. That's when he lost his grip. The lid clanked on the jar top and then slid down with a series of rattles ending in a clunk. Fear instantly gripped Billy J as he grabbed the lid to silence it. Frozen in place, he turned to see the cash roll and sock full of change sitting in plain sight. If Daddy came into the room to see what caused the racket, he would instantly foresee his plan with his backpack, the money, and fresh clothes he was wearing. Billy J knelt frozen in place, petrified, as the explosion from the nitroglycerin being rattled and jarred. 6. The bottle of whiskey must have done its job. Seconds morphed into a minute, and Daddy never stumbled into the kitchen. Luck was on his side. The mistake he had made failed to awaken the beast. Billy J grabbed the money roll and quickly stuffed it into his pack and then shouldered it, ready to start his run. That's when something caught the corner of his eye, the one that wasn't swollen almost shut. It stood firm and staunch like a tall silo in an empty field. The goddamn mason jar. It beckoned him to come wield it in his hands again, to feel the power its contents held, the authority of doling out its punishments. He sidestepped the chair, grabbed up the sock, and walked over to the table, eyes fixed as if in a trance. Setting the sock down, he picked up the jar, unable to fight the desire to do so. He absorbed the various tiles and the words emblazoned in bold black etchings that lay haphazardly across the table. He quietly spoke each one as he picked it up between his fingers and felt their sharp edges before silently sliding them back into the jar. Dark. Slap. Hit. Dunk. There was, of course, no longer a tile scribed with grace on its face. Daddy had removed it and then tossed it into the scattered trash spread across the floor. He scanned the room, searching quickly but intently for it. An internal thought instantly overtook his thinking, and he quietly uttered, "There was never any fucking grace in this house. Why start now? He doesn't deserve it. More than anybody else, he's owed the worst of judgments." Vengeance overwhelmed his previous desire to just run. Instead, he felt compelled to doling out the consequences himself of the judgment game and its wrath. He'd been the only recipient his entire life of that damned mason jar. His mama came very close several times with threats of its outcome. No doubt about it, she too got beat all the time. But the game? It was reserved for him alone. "Well now, it's Daddy's turn," he whispered, and slowly, methodically began to swirl the jar around in circles. The tiles spilled over each other as his hand began to shake them, mocking his daddy's hands he had watched so many times himself, swallowed up in fear of which wooden tile would spill out onto the table, which form of hideous cruelty would be used on him. He paid no attention to how loud the sound of his actions made. He didn't care. He was under the spell of the jar. He longed to hear the sound of the angered rattlesnakes quivering their tails in warning of impending doom. The sound that in the past instilled terror inside, just like Daddy in an unspoken instant. He halted the jar and tilted it slowly to the tabletop, so careful of an angle steep enough to call the tiles to slide towards the rim, but slow enough to control only one to breach the edge, just like his daddy did, carefully jiggling it until that one and only wooden piece gently spilled onto the surface. A slow, timely sting like the venom being pumped into one's bloodstream. A small square of bait fell silently onto the table, but landed upside down, leaving his daddy's retribution still unseen. Billy J's heart boldly pounded within his chest like big bass drums from the school band, hammering an explosive cadence of anticipation. His normal feelings of fear now transformed and converted into power and wrath. It felt awkward and unfamiliar, but it felt so damned fulfilling. He set the jar down beside the faceless tile and reached his hand out. Billy J lifted it in between his trembling fingers, hesitating for only a moment before slowly turning it over. 7. An eerie stillness swallowed Billy J's thoughts as well as the room's emptiness when his eyes read the word etched into the tile's wooden face. He had never imagined the excitement coursing throughout his veins would be this kind of exhilaration. He had always been on the receiving end where only terror was felt. He was never the one in charge who doled out the consequence of the jar. That difference between receiving and giving such a verdict battled a tug-of-war inside his mind. He had always felt guiltless, and any punishment from the jar was unfair. He had committed no wrongdoing. His daddy, on the other hand, would be overwhelmingly justified with any reprimand doled out from the jar. Daddy's entire life was an unending crime against him and his mama. His daddy could possibly drink his guilt away from his own goddamned conscience, but he couldn't drown it from his or his mama's. He slowly laid the small wooden scribed punishment face up onto the table beside the jar. His eyes moved upward as if he were able to stare into his daddy's eyes across the table as he had felt him do to him so many times before. In his make-believe moment of wielding total power and control, he smiled an evil and mocking smile, then quietly but firmly spoke the single-syllable word. Beat. He knew he didn't have the strength in his young body to beat his daddy bad enough to counter his ability to strike back in reprise. A feeling of letdown hovered inside his head, but he found himself unable to just leave the tile lying on the table and walk away with its judgment unanswered. He scanned the kitchen looking for a way where he could overcome and carry out its justice. His frown turned upward into an evil grin when the answer came to him in the form of the coin-filled sock boldly staring back at him. Yeah, the sock that held part of his daddy's precious fucking savings. What could be more fitting? He questioned. Billy J reached over and picked it up. It was weighty in his hands. It could certainly do some major damage in the right place. Without much more of a thought, he tightly grasped it and ominously walked through the kitchen's entryway into the living room, the change stretching the sock towards the floor from the weight of the coins pulling downward. His daddy still lay passed out on the couch, his bottle nearly ready to drop from his hand to the floor. His wretched eyes still closed tightly in slumber. Light snores rhythmically escaped his callous lips. He hated the man he now stood over. His eyes coldly stared at the evil in his father's face. The weathered lines across his forehead, the graying stubble that shadowed his cheeks masking any form of humanity there. He was disgusted with everything about him. The way he drank, the way he treated him and his mama, even the smallest of things like the filthy clothes he wore and the careless way he trashed the home they lived in. He loathed him. Billy J. wrapped the stretched sock twice around his right hand, drawing it closer to his wrist, and began to slowly swing it back and forth in his tightened grip like the pendulum of the grandfather's clock sitting in the corner of the room. Click, clock, tick, tock. Feeling the heaviness of it as gravity helped increase the weight of the coins, pulling his muscles to tighten. He imagined the weight of the coins smacking down onto the face of the devil lying unsuspecting before him. He instantly and effortlessly swung his hand upward as it traveled high above his head, almost brushing the ceiling, hovering no more than a millisecond while it towered above his daddy's head. Then, without hesitation, the weighted pendulum swung quickly downward, hard and fast as if the hangman's lever had been pulled. The sock's landing ended with a dull thud as crimson-red liquid exploded from his victim's face and a shower of brightly beaded droplets painting the couch and walls. The explosion was followed with an immediate sharp groan as the whiskey bottle sanctimoniously fell from his grip to the floor with a quiet thump that echoed above the moaning wails of his agony. His bloodied eyes appeared to cry as they attempted to focus, while his hands quickly crept towards his face to nurse the pain-filled swelling and jellied flesh. Billy J. could barely see his daddy's shocked reaction through his own swollen eye he had suffered earlier by the now curled-up body on the sofa. A wicked smile grew across Billy J.'s face, and it was indeed the satisfying smile he had hoped it would be. One of accomplishment. He had finally given the punishment his daddy deserved for the years of abuse he had doled out to them, his mama and him. The mean and vulgar filth he had spewed through the years, the repeated rapes and beatings his mama had endured, his own suffering from his unrelenting and inhumane tortures, the lack of any attempt at love being shown to either one of them, the drunken rages from out of nowhere. He never imagined just how good such a horrible thing like this act could feel. It was guiltless pleasure. It was emotional payback. It was an epiphany, and he felt its instant addiction react inside, telling him he would need another fix. "How do you like that, you fucking bastard?" He spoke in a monotone yet deathly calm voice as he coldly stared at his daddy's agony. The fucker's cowardice attempt to cover his face as he watched his young son swing his arm upward for another revenge-filled strike he would be unable to halt. A moment later, Billy J. again pulled his arm down hard with all the force he could muster, connecting another bone-crunching blow to his daddy's face and hands. A loud yelp of brutal excruciation instantly bellowed out, overshadowing the sound of the coins within the sock jingle-jangling in chaotic chimes. "That one was for Mama, you worthless fuck." Young Billy took his time to remove his backpack as he watched his daddy roll up in a ball of agony and cry out in tears, "Please, stop!" Tears like he had never witnessed before from the man who so easily gifted those same tears of pain to family. He calmly stowed the bloody change-filled sock into the pack, placing it next to the money roll, and then threw it across his back. He walked a bit taller with pride through the front door. He didn't feel any urge to look back again, knowing there was nothing left there for him to miss. He did feel as if he were leaving one thing behind, though. It only took a flash to realize what it was. It was his last bit of innocence. The devil had just stolen his soul today, but it had felt good. It felt really good. He had a purpose now with his new start in life. He could now cuss like his daddy, like a grown-up. And of course, he could now judge and execute punishments, just like his daddy used to. He didn't need no fucking mason jar to do it. One foot after the other almost skipped through the yard as the sun dipped just below the horizon of the new chapter he was entering. The world was now his for the taking. He felt alive for the first time ever. And it felt good.
The merciless sun hung in the barren sky like a heat lamp, beating down on the heath below. The heather seemed to plead to the skies for some reprieve from the baking sun, and the air hung still and sweltering. The only sound was the faint splashing of a failing stream echoing up from a deep, narrow ravine that ran the length of the vale, hidden from sight by parched brown bracken and crossed by an ancient wooden beam. Suddenly a single, hard crack split the silence, repeating from the surrounding hills like a ricochet. A red grouse burst from the ground and rose into the southern sky, the beating of its wings panicked and irregular. It dove sharply down the northern bank of a scrub-covered slope, flying low over the dull green heather before turning sharply east, away from the ravine and upward, its red feathers flashing in the sunlight. A lone figure appeared on the crest of the heath, his hands working hurriedly to reload the single-barrel shotgun. He snapped the barrel into place and aimed, recoiling backward as the shotgun blasted again, but the bird was now little more than a faint smudge against a pale, bleached skyline. The man stood still for a moment longer, frozen in place, the barrel of his gun aimed squarely at nothing. He turned his bearded, wrinkled face to the sun and squinted, raising his top lip as if disgusted. With a sigh, his poise slackened, and he lowered the weapon. "Time's moving on," he muttered quietly, his tone resigned and thoughtful. With a swift, practiced movement, he slung the weapon over his left arm and removed his cap to wipe his brow, revealing dark hair damp with sweat. It has been a rough season so far. A sweltering summer had bled into a dry autumn, forcing most local wildlife to stay in the shade, making them tough to find and even tougher to keep a bead on with the constant stifling heat. For a hunter as old as Jonah, it was getting harder and harder to stay sharp when all his body wanted was a cool drink of water and a shaded chair to enjoy it in. He had made only 2 kills in the last week. This, coupled with a slump in gun club customers, meant his secondary income of grouse and pheasant sales quickly became his main stead. The way things were going, he would be completely out of pocket by the end of the month. With a grunt of resolution, he replaced the cap and paced steadily down the slope to the ravine, crossing the bridge with care. His footsteps were sure and practiced as he descended to follow the flight of the grouse, the sun on his back. He had never felt older. Time seemed to be speeding up, pushing him forward like a runaway train with him lashed to the front, his life flying past him in a blur, making it harder and harder to distinguish one day from the next. He woke, ate, shot, ate, and slept. And each season, the hills felt more barren, more silent, less welcoming. His foot rolled on a loose rock, and he stumbled, barely keeping his balance. His thoughts returned to the present, and he became dimly aware of a dull buzz at the edge of his hearing. Jonas stopped and looked about him, trying to determine the direction of the sound. On the hillside to his left, about 30 paces away behind a gritstone outcropping, a cloud of flies swarmed. Black specks undulated and revolved up into sight and down again. Jonas stood and watched for a moment, considering his choices. Flies meant a dead animal of some kind. This was nothing unusual. He had found various dead animals in his years around the heath, but it was always good to keep a rough idea of the type and number of animals found dead, as an increase in carcasses was often a sign of disease in the local population. Jonah went up to the rock, his breath dry and rasping. On the flat, baking surface of the outcrop lay the body of a pheasant. decomposed to a vague mass of copper feathers, bone, and decaying flesh. Jonah sat on his haunches and regarded the carcass from higher up the hill, vaguely swatting around his face. The dead bird appeared deflated, a sign of advancing decay, and in the shorter feathers of its breast and side he discerned the slow writhing of maggots. "Must be diseased," he said to himself in a heavy, grim tone, thinking of the effect this could have on his hunting chances if many other birds had been afflicted in the area. This was not the work of a hunt, or why would they leave it here? An animal, then? Predators killed for food and would drag their kill back to a place of safety before eating. No, this was almost certainly a disease. But something felt off. The feeling gnawed at Jonah from the back of his thoughts, and as he moved on, he looked again and realized where it came from. The carcass had been decapitated. He'd identified it by its copper feathers and general shape, but the characteristic red and green head was absent. From his initial viewpoint, the upper neck had been obscured by the wings. As he passed, its absence was plain. Jonah leaned forward to gain a closer look for any sign of the head when he felt a nervous tingle run up from the middle of his spine to his neck. He straightened and whipped his head towards the crest of the hill. A grouse was there, flapping its wings in panic, somehow caught in the scrub. Without thinking, Jonah raised the shotgun and, in an instant, had the bird squarely in his sights. His forefinger found the trigger. He applied pressure, braced for the explosive recoil, and stopped. The bird was still there, squawking and beating its wings maniacally above the front sight of his gun, no more than 10 yards away. It appeared to be caught on something, unable to lift more than a few inches before swinging back into the ground, tracing a short arc side to side like a mad windscreen wiper. Jonah felt stupefied. He had never seen anything like this. Snare traps were a standard hunting tool, but they usually clenched around the neck, strangling the animal. Whatever had this grouse was attached somewhere low down, around the legs. He approached slowly, his pulse throbbing through his thick, arthritic hands as they held the hot gun at his hip. The dry heather cracked beneath his feet with each step, punctuating the diminishing squawks of the tiring bird, now little more than whimpers. As he reached the creature, he found himself on the edge of a circular depression, around 30 yards side to side. In its low center, 2 large obsidian rocks leaned against each other in an inverted V. He took this in for an instant, then looked down at the grouse. Its wings twitched pathetically as it lay on its side, utterly exhausted from terror and confusion. There was no snare. The bird's right leg was wrapped with a sort of straw-colored twine made from plaited strands of dried grass, tied like a noose above the small talons. The strange rope was around a foot in length, its other end tied to a tapered peg of shining black stone that jutted from the earth like an exposed tooth, glinting harshly in the bright sunlight. Jonah squinted at the bizarre peg, his brow deeply furrowed. Dried bird droppings were scattered on the heather around the stone, and it was obvious that the bird had been there for some time. He must have startled it when he came up the bank, but why was it here? With a harsh cry, the bird suddenly burst into life again, startling Jonah out of his confusion. With swift, thoughtless movements, he released his shotgun, caught the bird by its neck, drew his knife, and decapitated it. Crimson blood splashed onto the heather as the body fell with a soft thud, beat its wings softly for a few moments, then lay still, blood oozing out of the slashed neck. Jonah stood motionless, warm blood trickling out of his closed fist. He opened his palm and, seeing the lifeless, rolled-back eyes, was struck with a bizarre feeling of déjà vu. He glanced back at the rotting corpse and then to the strange rock formation and felt his sense of balance warp with a gut-wrenching vertigo. his face contorted with fear and confusion. Suddenly, inexplicably, he felt unable to make sense of his surroundings. Was that sand around those rocks? In years of walking and hunting, he had never seen anything like this. It was like a slice of the desert had been lifted from far off and dumped here. He could not shake the feeling that he had somehow lost his way, but that was impossible, surely. He was only a few yards from the ravine, after all. And yet, as he stood there, unmoving, blood oozing between his knuckles, he realized with a cold dread that he could no longer hear the unseen stream. The sharp stab of the grosbeak against his palm barely registered as his clenched hands trembled uncontrollably. Something moved behind him, a vague, shuffling hush, and he spun just in time to catch a shadow flitting across the gap between the column-like rocks. He released the head and scrambled for his gun, now somehow cumbersome in his calloused hands, the end of the barrel shaking wildly. "What's that?" he croaked flatly, more as a statement than a question. His voice faltered against the thick air that pressed around his mouth and ears, smothering him. He licked his lips and tried again. "What's that?" I said. Nothing answered. The stones sat silently in the center of the depression, half sunken in the sand. Jonah frowned, inspecting the dusty, empty patch surrounding the rocks, his survival instincts firing up like an old electrical circuit. He slowly approached, his tattered boots sliding slightly on the fine sand, making it challenging to balance. The sun was high, casting a short shadow on the earth to the right of the stones, yet also somehow behind them. A purple shade is visible in the gap between them. His position gave a better view of the strange shadow between the rocks as he came lower into the circle. It looked like a patterned curtain hung there, the top half a speckled blue-black felt material with a bizarre purple hessian at the bottom. The darker top half seemed to stretch downward with each step down, matching Jonah's step. With a slight slip, Jonah stopped, his barrel trained on the gap. Something was new. Several faint black shapes appeared on the horizon between the strange grass sheet and the bruised upper half. He squinted down the gun's sights, trying to make sense of it. They looked like flies. As he watched, the black specks gathered in the center of the image, forming a strange, hulking figure. Transfixed, Jonah watched as the figure appeared to grow, bleeding into the grass. A cool chill spread on Jonah's sweating forehead. He reached to wipe it with his fingers and felt cold on the back of his hand. He stared dumbly at his palm for a moment, then reached forward, sweat glistening on his fingertips. The air ahead of him was cool. No, it was freezing. A shocked gasp of icy air froze Jonah's lungs as he looked to the sand before the unnatural gap and saw grains rolling outwards, pushed by an unseen breeze. He looked at the straw-like material and saw the subtle sway of the individual blades. It was grass beyond the gap, and something was running through it. A growing black mass was moving from a bruised skyline. He could hear its rasping breath and the subtle swiping of its claws as it galloped through the dry stalks, its two red, bleeding eyes fixed forwards, fixed on him. Jonah's legs spasmed as pure fear bolted through his nervous system, the old circuits overloaded. He fell heavily on his side. Gritty sand scraped his cheek and teeth as his face hit the ground. His shotgun flew from his hand, scuffing into the sand as he scrambled madly on all fours, fighting to climb the loose bank. He crested the circle, his arthritic knees burning, his lungs on fire. He glanced back and saw two sets of black claws protruding from bleeding, coarse-furred paws that burst from the gap and gouged into the rocks on either side. An extended, slathering jaw full of overlong teeth on a vaguely wolven face pushed into the opening, followed by an amorphous mass of variously colored furs, bleeding and oozing like a patchwork made of animal carcasses. The thing bellowed a wet, gravelly sound as it forced its way through, its bloody eyes fixed on Jonah. There was nothing else to do. He needed to cross the bridge. That was the only way out. He ran. He ran as fast as his legs would carry him. He ran past the weird snare, the decayed carcass, through the valley. He often stumbled, his aging body betraying him while his mind fired in overdrive. Behind him came a loud crack and the sound of rocks crumbling. It had broken through. He turned to look and saw the corpse thing looming on the horizon as it had in the gap before. A vast, bulging figure comprised of the blood, meat, and bone of dead animals. It gazed at him for a moment longer, then bellowed deafeningly, stretching its wolf-like head to the sky. Its clawed arms extended out to its sides, writhing and twisting. The pained cry sent another jolt through Jonah, and he fell through the bracken. His right knee, already burning, now erupted in white-hot agony. His scream of pain mingled with the creature's before it fell silent and dove into the brush, cracking through the bracken towards him. His knee utterly ruined, Jonah backstroked maniacally, reaching backwards with his arms and shuffling awkwardly toward the narrow bridge only a few yards away. He heard the stream behind him trickling over unseen rocks in the dark crevice. The bridge was too narrow to cross on his back. He risked losing his balance and falling 40 feet into the water. His teeth ground with the pain as he rolled over his stiff, swollen knee. The snap crunch of the creature's approach came louder and louder, its grating, rabid breaths rising in volume. He slid himself over the dry beams. The splintering wood tore into his old shirt, breaking off into his frail skin, and his right leg hung limply over the side like fishing bait. Finally, his hands grasped the base of the bracken on the other side, and he pulled with the last of his strength, his hands dampened with blood drawn by the sharp stems. The creature burst from the bushes behind him, sending earth and rock tumbling downwards in an echoing clatter as its claws dug for purchase above the edge of the drop. He could smell it now. The stench was stifling, a mix of fresh blood, feces, and raw decay. From this close, he could see the dead eyes of the creatures it used, their decaying bodies writhing and twitching as unnatural energy pulsed through them, their jaws gnashing. Fear settled in Jonah's chest as he lay there, propped up on his elbows, staring at the creature. It was too fast. With this realization, fatigue fell on him like a heavy blanket. He could feel the adrenaline strength draining from him. He was done, and the creature knew it. Its long, thin jaw seemed to widen into a sickly grin as it regarded him, eyes always locked on his. Thick, crimson blood dripped over blackened, crowded teeth. It began to cross the ravine, paw over paw, savoring the moment. The ancient wood creaked under its weight. Jonah breathed deeply and looked up at the sky. Above him, a single red-feathered bird soared, beautiful against the bleached sky, its brilliant red wings flashing in the sunlight. "Bollocks," he uttered plainly, and with one rapid movement pulled his left leg back and shoved with all his might, his heel against the beams, his elbows anchored into the earth. He felt his ligaments tear from his bones as he pushed beyond his body's tolerance. The creature screeched as the bridge first twisted, then lost its purchase on the bank and tumbled into the harrowing depths of the ravine. There was a squelching thud and a splash. Then all was quiet against the continued trickling of the water below. Jonah saw the thing's evil eyes widen in surprise before it disappeared down, roaring as it fell. Jonah lay back and looked up again. The bird was gone. His legs were numb. The blanket of fatigue fell on him once more, this time heavier and warmer. His vision fell to blackness. Someone was speaking to Jonah. He did not recognize the voice.
"Awake! You awake back there?"
His eyes opened, and he saw nothing but darkness above him. He was lying on something soft, jostled gently from side to side. A single beam of yellow light cut across the darkness ahead of him, and he saw that he was lying on the truck's back seat. The driver sat to his left, a man in his 50s wearing a light hunting jacket, regarding him with a look of concern and relief. The light of the passing cars reflected in his glasses, momentarily dazzling Jonah.
"Thank God for that. For a moment there I thought you'd gone and died on me. Now, don't get to worrying. I found you out there by the ravine. Looks like the old bridge finally gave up, aye? Lucky you didn't fall in. Made a right mess of your knees, though. Not to worry. You're not far from the hospital. Get you seen to in no time."
Jonah grunted his thanks and lay back. He was utterly exhausted, but his mind flitted through confused nightmare pictures as he dozed. Every bump in the road flared his knee pain and made him think of the bridge and the thing that had tried to cross it. Before long, the bright lights of the hospital emergency department entrance poured in through the back window. The door opened, and the driver stood silhouetted in the light, a wheelchair before him.
"Think we could get you into this? Here, let me help."
With an effort, Jonas struggled his way onto the chair. His knees were like swollen water balloons, hot to the touch and excruciating to move. As the man turned his chair, Jonah glimpsed the back of the old Land Rover. The cargo bed was covered in a blue tarp. It looked full. The material undulated and stretched in small hills over the unusual shape of the load. The driver caught his gaze.
"After seeing you off, I'm taking that lot to the vets."
The wheelchair bumped as they passed the automatic doors. Harsh, artificial light spilled over them.
"Strangest thing. We found a load of dead animals downstream from where I found you, where the ravine opens up. Looks like they were diseased or something. That might be why the hunting's been so tough this season. What's the matter?"
Jonah's eyes widened as the man spoke. His head spun to look back. Something dripped in the shadows behind the truck, and a small black shape fell onto the tarmac, briefly catching the light on coarse, bloody fur. In the hospital, they could not understand why he would not stop screaming.
I was awaiting an interview with a dying man, sitting in an uncomfortable chair, watching an ancient television set mounted high in the corner of the hospital waiting room that flashed riot scenes. Placards waving, black faces crying into cameras. The Capitol was burning, and youths running in the night with bandanas covering their faces as tear gas canisters spiraled out from police guns and bounced along the concrete. History was happening, yet I was assigned a pointless interview to go nowhere, to fill space in a local newspaper for people who are so dead themselves they didn't realize the printed word was deceased. Gone. Perhaps I could do a think piece about the latest race riot in the Capitol, but there wouldn't be much to think about in a small white town that remained an untouched, disinterested minor gear in the strange gyre that turned society. $50 an article for a master's degree in English. The world had gone to shit, and, from the scenes flashing across the television, it appeared to be diving further into chaos. Walter J. Cook's organs were shutting down one by one. An old girlfriend once told me that when she was in nursing school, a professor asked the class what caused 100% of all death. It seemed a trick question, but it wasn't. The answer was quite simple. Cardiac failure. No matter what causes it, the heart stopping is the ultimate direct cause. Everything else is just details. It seemed Cook would find that out soon enough. Death was for the old as far as I was concerned. I was young. I wanted the action, the chaos of life. I wanted to be covering the riots, the politics of the day, but everyone has to pay their dues and work their way up. And that's what I was doing that dark night. Walter J. Cook was a former town councilman who served on the town board for 2 uneventful decades as first selectman before retiring with a small pension and a touch of dementia. Cook had backed out of his driveway into the lane of a speeding van, which T-boned his old Buick and flipped the car onto its roof. Cook had sustained internal damage from the seatbelt jolting against his soft organs, and while he was awake and able to talk, though often quite nonsensically, the doctor said his body was essentially shutting down, and the waitlist for organ transplants far too long for any hope of recovery. My editor wanted a final interview with a man who had long been a town institution. Cook had no family that I could cross-reference with, or with whom I could write up their fond memories, so I was left with the last will and testament of what appeared to be the least interesting man on earth, and who was quite possibly insane at this point. I had seen pictures of Walter J. Cook before, bony shoulders and a sunken chest, with a belly that popped out just over the belt of his chinos, shirt always tucked in, and clothes always neatly pressed, and cared for as only elderly men who have retired, or whose children have grown and moved away, could wear. He grew up during a time when men wouldn't be caught dead in public in anything less than pressed clothes, nice socks, and decent shoes. Toward the end of his tenure as first selectman, in his old age, his skin retained a tightness in the face that was a testament to clean living and a knowledge that the world had once been a better place. That was what I thought while perusing through pictures of Cook in the Palastair Register's database. He had been well liked during his tenure, oversaw the construction of an entire new sports park, complete with basketball and tennis courts, soccer and baseball fields, and a playground for the children. He had kept Palastair relatively undeveloped, and that was the way people liked it. He would make appearances at the town parades and cookouts, and he smiled with full, well-cared-for teeth, and a certain pained look in his eyes. It seemed an awareness of something other, which I took to probably be the result of his time in Vietnam while serving in the army. But now Cook's appearance was shocking. He had withered down to virtually nothing, his body so light and brittle as to be lifted off the hospital bed by a small child. The air was static and smelled of rot and shit camouflaged with bleach. Plastic tubes and saline bags and cheap-looking medical computers that probably cost small fortunes wound their way into his veins so that he appeared merely the withering human facade of some mass-manufactured machine. Cook's eyes watched the small television in his room, the same news reports I had been viewing in the waiting room. His eyes didn't move, but he whispered, "So, you've come." "This man is here from the Palastair Register, Mr. Cook," the nurse said. "He wants to talk to you so everyone in town can see how you're doing. I want you to be nice to him, okay?" His head turned slightly, regarded her with disdain, and I saw the flash of something ugly. Something that rests in the dark depths of men, that wiggles its way out when all the vestiges of civilized life have been wrested from them. It was, in a word, hatred. She whispered to me, "He's not all there. He can be mean, say some disturbing things, hallucinate, or think you're someone else. I nodded, and Cook whispered inaudibly from what little breath was left in his lungs. "What's that, Mr. Cook?" I leaned closer to him and listened for the rasps of his ancient vocal cords. They came back with a haunting whisper. "I have so many things to tell you." I don't know how to write what I heard that evening, or what I heard over my follow-up interviews, which I have never dreamed I would conduct before that night. Even to this day, winding my way through his rambling, virulent, and inchoate stories seems to be a maze too complicated for me to solve. I can tell you what I did write for the Palastair Register the following week, after the veil of my former life had been so painfully lifted. Former First Selectman considers whole town family. A nice, happy, tight little piece with a quick synopsis of Walter Cook's long life, from birth in Missouri to his time as councilman. But that was entirely made up. I pieced together the short biography I had learned of him during my research, and made the nice title from his listing of several town council members over and over when I asked if he had any family left. But I couldn't write the truth. I couldn't write what he actually had to say. I couldn't write about what he kept referring to as the Immortal Coil. Every question I asked him seemed to lead into a darkness so insane that half of me thought it was pure hallucination, and the other half suspected that reality was far worse than any film or novel. Recording, June 6, 2015, 7:25 p.m. Can you tell me about your experience in the military during the Vietnam War, Mr. Cook? And how you've seen the world change from that time? Vietnam was the beginning, boy. Vietnam was where it all began. That's what I've been trying to tell the nurses here. That's where I met Major Kurtz. I had enlisted out of high school, but I was smart, see? During our basic training, a man came. We all suspected him as part of the CIA, and administered to us a written questionnaire that we were to all fill out as completely and honestly as possible. It wasn't like anything else in the Army. You're always filling out questionnaires, but none of them had been like this. It asked us bizarre questions, largely of a religious nature, asking us if we had ever used LSD or seen unexplained things in the sky. It asked about dreams and nightmares and family histories of insanity. Then, after the written part, we were each taken to a room and hooked up to monitoring devices like a lie detector. And then we were shown pictures. Pictures of dead children and other horrid things. And they gauged our reaction to them. It was all an examination to see if we were capable. Capable for what? Operation White Star, of course. Or what was Operation White Star? Even though I enlisted as a grunt, they pulled me into an office and offered me a position in a covert operation set up in Laos, with an officers' group being run by the Special Forces. See, officially, the point of our work there was to teach the Laosians how to fight off the North Vietnamese. It was run by the CIA even before the war began, started in 1961, I think. And it was called Operation White Star. Oh, I was out of my league with these guys. They needed a few of us grunts, but they needed ones with intelligence. Open minds, they said, for some of their reconnaissance work. It was better pay, more guerrilla-style combat rather than just getting shot in the ass guarding a boat dock. I was flown into Laos on an unmarked chopper, low to the trees where Charlie could take pot shots at us as we flew over. We touched down in a small village just over the Vietnamese line. The place looked empty, and when the pilot killed the engine, it was dead silent. You've never been in the jungle, I'm sure, but it's never dead silent. Not unless something dangerous is about. Then all the birds and monkeys and creatures shut their yaps and go into hiding. Well, this place was dead silent. The huts were empty. There were no villagers or soldiers. Nothing. But the pilot acted like this was all part of the routine. He led me up to a patch of land, an area that had been cleared out of the jungle. He told me to drop my stuff and just wait there. I said, "Wait for what, to get shot?" "Just shut your mouth and wait," he told me. Then he walked off back to the chopper, fired her up and took off. Just like that. And I was alone, standing in this clearing, just waiting to be killed. I waited for hours, you see. Hours I waited. And finally, right at dusk, this man, an American man, comes walking out of the jungle like he'd been sitting there watching me the entire time. And he just stares at me. He's wearing fatigues, but with no markings, no patches, nothing. He looks at me and says, "You can stay here alone or you can come with me. But if you come with me, there's no turning back. It's full commitment, not just for the war, but for life. Do you understand?" I always thought there was a dirty trick to play, but that's how they operate. Dirty tricks. Choices that aren't really choices. And then you're in over your head. So I said, yes. I didn't want to be left out there by myself. I couldn't walk to the nearest camp. I was in the middle of nowhere. He told me to leave my stuff and follow him. He led me up a long trail to the top of a mountain. It was night by the time we reached the top, and the jungle was pitch black. But we came to this clearing, and there were all these people, 50 or so villagers on their knees bowing to a Buddhist shrine that was made out of wood and copper. Really a beautiful piece of religious art. And there were all the rest of the soldiers, probably 20 of them, myself included. There were 2 large fires burning and 1 villager tied up inside the Buddhist shrine, gagged and wrapped around a stake. Major Kurtz, 'cause that's who it was that led me up there, took a torch from one of the fires and handed it to me. And he said, "Go burn it down." I said, "What? What do you mean?" And then he screamed at me like some kind of demon. And he said, "Burn it down!" The villagers were still all on their knees with their heads bowed, and the other soldiers were looking at me like they were likely to shoot me where I stood. "Light this gook up, or so help me you will take his place," Kurtz told me. I did it. I'm not proud of it, but I understand it now. It was part of the initiation. Something that has to be done. A price has to be paid. You have to leave everything behind and become an empty vessel. Everything you thought about, right and wrong, love and honor. Everything that we were taught throughout our childhood must be sacrificed. You see, there are 2 paths in life. The right-hand path and the left-hand path. The left hand is the opposite. It is anathema to everything that we have been taught is right. And that is what White Star was. It was the left-hand path. It wasn't just war or soldiers. It was religious. It was a belief system that knew no bounds. I lit the man in that shrine on fire that night. And it changed my life, you understand. Kurtz was not just the platoon leader or some CIA spook, no. He was a religious leader. He was a prophet. He was brilliant. The entire North Vietnamese army was terrified of him, of us. He took whatever he wanted, and the government was only too happy to give it as long as they didn't have to look with their eyes. He performed rites in that jungle at night that, oh, to this day I still can't put into words. It was a beautiful horror. They brand you, you see, but not on your skin. They brand your mind, your very soul, with the immortal coil. Are you smiling, Mr. Cook? Oh, you are so young and dumb. That's why I asked for you, the brilliant naivete of those who think they know the world. Excuse me? Oh, don't be offended, it's not your fault. The entire world is populated by nothing more than a bunch of carbon copies of people like yourself. Take a look up at that television screen there. You see those people out in the streets rioting? You see those reporters with their shirts and ties and dramatic looks on their faces? It is all an act on a gigantic stage. It is all a veil on which we show movie pictures to entertain your young, delusional minds. Even your universities, your scholars, your politicians are all actors in a play that they don't even know exists. And they play their parts well. All of them. Puppets. I think this is enough, Mr. Cook. I'm sure the people of this town will be horrified to hear what you've told me tonight. I hope you're just delusional, but I can guarantee you that I will be looking into this offensive and barbaric story of yours. You won't tell them. No, you won't. You want to be a big shot. You want to be a great reporter someday. You watch. You listen to me. You asked me how the world has changed since my time in the war. It has changed, but only because we made it change. So you run back to your little life and write your bogus story for the goddamn Palastair Register. It'll mean nothing and go nowhere. The ravings of a dying, demented old man. I've been telling the nurses here all kinds of stories this past week. No one will believe a word of what you say. But if you do want to be a reporter, if you do want the big scoop, you keep your eyes on the television. You come back in 2 days, when Dallas is burning over a Baptist minister being shot by some young skinhead brigade, and then you come back here and tell me that I've offended you. You go back and do your little research project. And then come back here and tell me what you found out. You go, little boy. Nurse! Nurse! They're coming for me! Nurse! End recording. How does one write something like that? Is it responsible to print the ravings of a dying man who is quite possibly delusional in his death throes? My editor, Bob Haskins, was pushing me for the piece the next day, but I didn't have it. I need more time. I told him. But really, I needed to digest it, run it through my mind, figure out what, if anything, I was going to write. Bob, did Mr. Cook request me specifically to come talk to him? A funny look. No. I requested you, and I'm requesting you to get that piece written right quick. It's a little more difficult than that, Bob. He's not exactly telling me things that we want to print. Yeah, well, senility's a bitch. I did a little digging, but only came up with hints and possibilities. Cook hadn't been completely off his rocker. There was an Operation White Star that operated in Laos in the early 60s. It had been covert but ended at the outbreak of war in 1965 and was supposedly no longer operational when Walter Cook was in the military. I could find nothing on this mythical Major Kurtz. Nothing. But then everything as well. I would have to dig longer, and that would take more time. There had to be 1,000 people with that name that went through the military during the Vietnam era. Indeed, it seemed like every fourth soldier was named Kurtz or Cook. They popped up everywhere. Cambodia, covert missions into China, My Lai, Air America, Son Thang, and Ton Phong. A lot of ugliness seemed to carry those names. Men who appeared minor grunts, nameless and faceless American soldiers when considering an isolated incident, suddenly became a strange game of connect the dots between Kurtzes and Cooks across the Vietnam space-time continuum. Different men? The same? Nearly impossible. Walter J. It was exhausting. My eyes hurt, my brain burned. I thought of him laughing and smiling, recounting his weird story, and I contrasted that with images and impressions built up over reviewing his years on the town council, smiling in photographs, beloved member of the community. No wife, no kids, no relatives to speak of, no amassed wealth. He lived in a small 2-bedroom ranch situated in the middle of a grassy field near the edge of Pallistaire. His past seemed uniquely unremarkable until you listened to his stories. But then it wasn't his history that was so disturbing. Rather, it was his prophecy. Dallas burned, and my head spun, and there was the sudden sensation of a great and powerful veil being lifted by a deranged mind. The television screens were plastered with pundits and attorneys and police officials and politicians, all bickering between themselves, describing the gyre as it turned. Something, I could not say what, seemed to be tightening. But when is that just a personal feeling, and when is such a feeling evidenced and proven by reality? 2 days later, he said, and here it was on the television screen happening before my very eyes, and the nation was transfixed. Bob Haskins pushed my story deadline back to make room for AP articles about Dallas. I went back to the hospital and found Walter J. Cook looking somehow even more skeletal, his eyes piercing through orbital cavities. "Ah," he whispered. "And how is your article progressing? Are you confronting the world with the real story of Walter J. Cook?" "We pushed your story back to make room for news that's actually important," I said. "I threw my bedpan at a nurse today. Got my shit all over her shoes. Where would you like to begin?" "How about why you're telling this to me?" He smiled. "How did you know about Dallas?" I said. "Ask a better question," he said. Cook's house was a small single-story ranch situated in the middle of a sloping field whose crest dipped over a far hill. It was set back from a road that was barely wide enough to hold 2 cars passing in the night. This house was a bit of an enigma. Well, perhaps it was comfortable for a single man in his 70s. It seemed a lower class level than would be expected from a town selectman. The position paid well enough, nearly $80,000 a year. But Walter's house did not exude the kind of largesse that one would associate with someone making such wildly massive claims. Claims of pioneering the pornography industry from the sale of opium shipments running from Laos and Cambodia to the States, Wall Street investments in the 80s during the massive climb and divestment of Procter & Gamble before the poison gas leak in India, the claims of satanic conspiracy diluted through the 90s, run through with susceptible therapists, psychiatric quacks, and attention-starved women. Kurtz and Cook and their immortal Coil dipped long, devilish fingers into nearly every industry. They were spread like star constellations across the globe. What does all this have to do with Dallas? What do you know of Charlie Manson? He was a raving lunatic that killed a bunch of people and has a swastika tattoo on his forehead. That's just the beginning, he said. Kurt sent me to meet Charlie in July of '69, just before his great ascension. I could feel the power emanating off of him like heat from a black sun. Looking into his eyes was like looking into a doll's eyes. He was proof, evidence, that we were all merely puppets. He was evidence of the turns of the gyre, the forces that move like liquid through us all. There is no right. There is no wrong. There is just what is and what will be. I found Charles in a cave at the edge of the Mojave Desert, an arid, horrid place spotted with Joshua trees and rock outcroppings. I had followed the glow of firelight, and near dawn I had found them in a cave entrance, naked, fleshy, slithering over each other like a nest of snakes. Charles stood so close to me. He stared at me with those doll eyes. He took me by the hand and led me beyond the dull glow of firelight into the back reaches. The cave narrowed like a downward spiral, a coil into the earth, and on it was painted words of the coming war. Helter-skelter, swastikas and painted images of strange rites, pentagrams and stars of David. Then, 3 figures moved forward from the darkest reaches of the cave. I could barely make them out, but as they came into the light, I saw it was 3 women, fully nude but wearing the heads of animals. A buffalo, a goat, and a stag that had all been recently slaughtered and hollowed out, still with the stink of blood and meat. They walked to me and they took me by the hand. And I tell you, kid, I've never been so moved by a woman in my life. We laid down together and we fucked until I was nearly dead from dehydration. We never removed the animal heads, and I began to think of them as different creatures, mythical creatures, created from an amalgamation of man and animal, but with their dead eyes, their doll eyes. I cried out in ecstasy, and it echoed all through those cave walls down the coil of darkness. And I remember something strange sitting in the deepest reaches of that crypt. It was a man, I think, sitting cross-legged in the dark, watching us. And for some reason I knew deep down that he was pulling the strings of our intertwined arms and legs and cock and cunts. It was he, the great stage director of the puppet show. His eyes glowed, his teeth white as snow-capped mountains. He sat like an emaciated Buddha. I remember I wanted him. I wanted him so badly that I would do anything just to touch him, but he would not allow it. He kept pulling our strings till I was nearly dead, and the girls were bleeding between their legs. I never truly saw the puppet master. When I woke, there was nothing there, and Charles was once again dancing and singing in the firelight of the cave entrance, and his people were slithering together in the darkness, making strange noises and gestures and eating pills and mushrooms. I walked out of the cave and Charles stared at me once again with those massive doll eyes. "Helter-skelter," he said to me. Again, what does this have to do with Dallas? Oh, that boy that shot down the preacher in Dallas. He had a tattoo, didn't he? The number 88 on the back of his head. Of course he did. I popped the lock in the back door of Walter Cook's house and cracked the door jamb going through. Didn't matter. The old man would never be returning, and the house would probably be razed to make room for a modern colonial. The air was stale, unmoved for the past 2 weeks that Walter was in the hospital. It held that boring, unremarkable old man smell. Dust comprised of withering skin particles and mothballs. In that instant, I saw Walter J. Cook as a rather pathetic figure. For all his delusions of grandeur, his own Coil was proving more mortal by the second. Walter J. Cook lived a quiet life in the town of Pallistaire. Even when serving as first selectman, he was not known for entertaining house guests and was usually quite brief at social or town functions. But the man got things done, which led to his re-election several times over. People naturally assumed that he was just a bit shy, or a bit of a recluse, having never met the right woman. There were even rumors of him having never met the right man, and that his tiny house set in a field was his form of keeping things easy and simple, like a monk taking a vow of poverty and chastity. But the house looked as if it had never even been lived in. Everything was set up like a fully furnished rental that hadn't been touched in years, or a stage set from a 70s sitcom. The wallpaper and furniture seemed to move backward in time, and, in my mind, I could hear the echoing laugh track of the imaginary audience. But they were all laughing at me. I was the joke. I was the jester on a stage being laughed at by principalities of the real. I felt a strange sense of hate and anger standing in that tiny house, thinking of the things that Walter had told me. I was looking for that audience, searching under couches and in cabinets, hearing their laughter, and knowing that they were pointing at me and whispering to each other with hushed voices, almost embarrassed for me because I was too clueless to know any better. I knocked over lamps and smashed a mirror in an outburst of rage. There was a painful bloom in my stomach. The unfurling, or was it the uncoiling, of something long dormant but suddenly awakened, and sick with hunger. I tore into his rooms, ripped open beds, emptied drawers, kicked in closets, searching for something, anything that showed me. Showed me what? To this day, I'm unsure. I broke sinks and tipped over the ancient television, broke pipes and upturned tables like some Midwestern teenager on a wilding. I was breathing hard and heavy, delirious, and not able to make sense of myself, much less this strange, totally unremarkable and boring place that I had just desecrated with chaos. A single door was locked beneath the stairway, a hiding place for the laughing audience. "You miserable fuck!" I said, and I kicked through the door. And, indeed, there was a sound of laughter when the stairway beneath the house was revealed through the kicked-in door. There was the smell of cold concrete, heavy with subterranean moisture. I hit a light switch, and there seemed an endless cascade of fluorescent lights kicking on that echoed in what sounded like a cavern. I took the steps slowly and cautiously to the bottom. The basement was the size of a football field, solid concrete painted a dull steel gray and seamless. The space was vast, so much larger than the house itself, extending up the hillside. It seemed a massive fallout shelter, but it was not stocked with food and supplies or anything of that sort. It was spare and sparse, and nearly empty except for the walls. They were adorned with massive canvases of symbols, completely stark, simple, and utilitarian. A red canvas with white circle and black swastika, four-sided pyramids with the all-seeing eye at their apex, the sigil of Baphomet, variations of crosses set in circles and misshapen spirals, black on white. 4 long glass cases were filled with what seemed to me artifacts both ancient and modern, like some kind of strange museum. Set in the middle of the wall of images were 3 massive statues, figures of men 10 feet tall, featureless, and made of pure metal. Their smooth contours stood with heads slightly bowed, as if in contemplation or, perhaps, looking down on humanity. Their presence caused an anxiety in me that I had never felt before. I almost turned and ran from their gaze, as if they would suddenly come to life and take me. To this day, I still see them standing there, watching. On the floor, massive and painted in black, the number 88 turned sideways and overlapped to form a double helix, like 2 symbols of infinity side by side, showing the DNA strand that guides all of life. And I suddenly began to realize the nature of the immortal coil. At the far end of this massive basement museum was a single high-backed leather chair, set before a screen with an old film projector, strung up with 2 large coils of film. The fluorescent lights didn't extend this far, so it was in shadow. I feared someone was in the chair, but it was empty. I pawed at the projector. I flipped a switch, and the machine turned on with a burning light, and a square appeared on the screen as the film began to whirl over the projector. Images began to form, the pictures racing ever faster, forming movement, contrasts, faces, people, and then things. Things that I could never forget. Recording June 10th, 2015, 11:13 a.m. "The next place will be Oakland," he said. "But don't worry. Soon it will come for all of you. It has always been a war, and it comes to all of us sooner or later." What will happen in Oakland? It doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is that it will happen. And it will happen again and again and again, till it is over. What is the immortal coil? What does all of this have to do with it? You want simple answers, don't you? Not so bright, maybe. Wouldn't it be easy if I just told you everything like a TV show? I could. Maybe. But it wouldn't help you at all. You'd get locked up in the psych ward if you uttered a word of it to anyone else. No, I don't wish that on you. I just want you to carry it. To keep it going. I don't think you know me very well then, if you think that I would keep up your legacy. No. I'm not imparting to you some dying wish like a man passing the torch to his son. No. I'm spreading to you, like a disease, A cancer that will eat away at you. You want to leave? You don't want to carry this illness? Really, it's too late, but you can leave now if you want. But we both know that you won't. Curiosity kills. It drives insane. It will spread from me to you to countless others. You will try to prevent it, but you will be incapable. For good or bad, the immortal coil will continue to wind tighter and tighter, and you will help it, like it or not, till there is the ultimate war. Helter-skelter, my boy. Just like Charles predicted. Never gonna happen, you crazy old fuck. Oh, you think not? It's already happening. Every day, every city, every news report, every person. I think your immortal coil is taking a little too much credit. You're making a kitten into a tiger. In 2002, I attended an unofficial conference of small-town mayors and first selectmen in Las Vegas. You can look that up if you like. It's in the town records. Quite an affair, I must say. All lights and booze and call girls running through the Bellagio with a withered and gray-haired old white man on each arm. Orgies going all through the night with Viagra and cocaine in candy bowls. The girls, they let us do whatever we wanted. I had never been the same since that night with Charlie in the desert, and so my tastes were quite different, I suppose. But those girls did not flinch once. They did not ask questions. I was able to, well, anyway, enough of that. It was quite an affair, to say the least. But the pinnacle of the conference was our observation of a great neonatal surgeon. We were transported by a series of buses out of the city limits into the desert. A trip which took several hours until we came to a large circular building in the middle of nowhere. It had a very low profile because most of it was underground. We were led down a spiral deeper and deeper under the earth, and then into a massive surgical theater. Everything dark but the bright white light in the center, and viewing screens above the lights so we could view the intricacies of the procedure. There was a man, the surgeon, who appeared quite older than any of us at the conference, but I tell you, there was never a steadier hand in all the world. He moved as if he were an animatronic prop with wrinkled human skin pulled over its pneumatic workings. There were 2 nurses with him. I never saw his face in full because of the mask, but I could see his eyes and his hands and his movements. And I tell you, that was enough to show me that this was no ordinary man. He was something else. But definitely to call him human would not be sufficient. The same with Kurtz, and that figure brooding in the back of Charlie's cave in the Mojave. He was something other. 2 police officers escorted a black girl into the center of the theater. She couldn't have been more than 20, and she was feisty, fighting them the whole time. But finally, they managed to get her on the table and strap her wrists and ankles down with leather straps. The surgeon injected her with a large needle, which caused her to calm down almost immediately. We could all see she was pregnant. Probably 6 months, I'd say, but I don't have an eye for these kinds of things. No experience, you understand. Then he began. She was put under anesthesia, and the surgeon took a scalpel to her protruding belly. He cut gently at first, and then harder, and the blood was allowed to spill on the floor, and it was collected in a shallow ring etched into the concrete that enclosed the surgical table. The 3 nurses stood in the background with the police officers, hands folded in front of their laps, stone still, like porcelain figurines. We watched closely on camera as the surgeon pulled back the thin layers of skin and muscle and fat, and then exposed the sleeping child in the mother's womb, shiny with membrane and pulsing umbilical cord. Then he cut into the child, a small incision at the base of its tiny skull. All the while, both mother and child slept under the gas, and we could see the blood pulsing between them. Then, he delicately cut into the brain and removed a small piece from the child's brain stem. It was a quivering piece of pink and gray gelatin, no larger than the child's fingernail, but on the screen it was massive. Glorious. A true piece of the primordial life. The surgeon held it up for all of us to see, and we applauded him and his work. He placed the jellied life in a small container and handed it off to one of the nurses. The child and the girl were stitched up and returned to the streets from where they came. I believe she ended up in an insane asylum, babbling incoherently about what she had seen and been through. But oh, that was a glorious night. We painted the town red that night, as the old saying goes. But I tell you, oh, come now, where are you going? The nurse won't be by for my sponge bath for another hour. Wait. Wait. I've heard enough. I stumbled from the back door of Walter J. Cook's house and into the gray, dying dusk. I felt drunk or drugged. Everything spinning and whirling. The ground beneath me had shattered and I was plunging into the abyss. I walked into the field that ascended the hillside behind Cook's house, and it seemed so endless. I walked and stumbled through the tall grass, moving toward the strange horizon. I thought that I might just walk for eternity then, leaving everything behind, leaving the world behind. Images flashed through my mind like lightning flashes. Images from the old film reel. Images from my recent memory. Images of the future. I haven't even begun to tell you all the strange and mysterious wonders. You will never be the... Wait. What are you doing there, son? Oh, I see. You think this will somehow make it better. You think this will somehow save your soul. I'm already dying. What good will it do? It doesn't matter. But don't you see, son? Don't you see the position that you have been placed in now? Don't you see the decision that stands before you? There, at the crest of the hill, the gray horizon where the earth spills over into the dull evening sky, I saw them approach, as if rising up out of the earth itself. And I stopped and stood before them, helpless, reeling, and they looked down at me with their hideous countenance, and raised their feminine arms to me while boring holes in my skull with their dull, animal eyes. How do you think you'll get away with it, son? In this hospital full of people, with me hooked up to all these contraptions like some cyborg. All of them will scream bloody murder, and you'll never escape. I see the rage in your eyes, son. I know the feeling. I've been in your same position myself. Think of all the stories you could break, all the headlines you could garner with the full knowledge of the coming hardships. You want to be something more than a dumb, small-time reporter, don't you? I could see their animal heads in the dying light, their gloriously feminine bodies reaching their hands out to me as if to take me beyond the hill crest, into the horizon. I could feel it, sense it. Just over the bend of earth, there was a dark force radiating just out of sight, a dull glow piercing the darkness. There was nothing but rage and evil and cunning. The puppet master was dancing his strings as the vixens were calling for me to fall into their embrace. Which one, I wondered? Kurtz? Manson's demigod? The surgeon? Which one had tread this soil? Which one waited just over the ridge behind Walter J. Cook's house? Fine, son. That's the way you want it. Go for it. You are throwing your life away to hasten the death of a dying man. But you have your choice. You will make it soon enough. You can try to forget, but you never will. Everywhere you look, you will see the immortal Coil, and it will...
I spent my childhood in a small town. Long, winding, single-lane roads with speed limits that topped out at 70 miles per hour were common. Modest-sized houses on large lots dotted the landscape, innumerable trees providing privacy and anonymity. One of those houses was mine. It was set back from the street about 100 feet, behind a row of tall, slippery elms that lined the road. A gravel path wound around hedges and between a waist-high wooden fence. I never had any siblings, so my free time was spent with an open book clutched in my hands. My parents encouraged this isolating activity as it kept me out of trouble, out of the road, and out of the woods behind my house. The woods were thick, effectively blocking out what lay beyond my backyard. Though there was a high fence enclosing our property, getting into the forest was as simple as moving aside 2 panels that had been knocked loose by my dad's lawnmower. To me, those loose panels were an invitation to a world begging to be explored. My parents, well, they didn't see it that way. "You could get lost out there," was a typical warning from my mother. "Once you get a certain distance in, you won't be able to tell which way is north or south. You never know what kind of animals are out there, son," my father was fond of saying. "There are wolves and coyotes and possibly even bears." These warnings never frightened me. What did frighten me was a tale my friend Scott told me. "You know the real reason your parents won't let you in the woods, right?" He asked me one day when we were sitting on my back patio sipping cans of Pepsi. I was in my favorite chair, a white recliner with soft floral print cushions. Scott sat cross-legged on a bench made of dark brown wood nearby. We were both facing the forest, watching as the sun started to approach the tops of the trees in the purple-orange sky. I believe we were both 11 at the time. "No," I answered. I wasn't sure if I should have felt embarrassed at this admission. Scott slipped the last few drops of cola out of his lip on his can and set it on the wooden floor of the deck. He straightened like he was ready to deliver a speech. Anticipation painted his face. "There's a place in the woods," he began. "A very specific place. You'll only find it if you're looking for it, and even then you may not find it." He reached down for his Pepsi, but jerked his hand back, remembering it was empty. I shook my half-finished can at him, and he nodded. I went into the kitchen through the sliding glass doors on the deck and grabbed 2 fresh Pepsis. "Hey, Scott," I asked, tossing him his soda. He looked up at me. "What did you mean when you said, 'Even then you may not find it'?" "I mean," Scott said, opening his soda, "that you have to want to find it. Like, desire it so bad you don't care what else happens." Though I had no idea what Scott meant by this, my spine tingled. The light outside was slowly disappearing as I took my seat. "Anyways," my friend continued, "this place is a sacred place. Like, very important to a certain group of people." "Indians," I blurted out. We'd just watched The Shining earlier that week, and Indian burial grounds were fresh in my minds. "No, stupid," he said, smiling. "It's important to the doorway seekers." He'd been messing with me. Doorway seekers? That sounded like something he pulled out of his ass. Scott looked at me with an expression that was part victory, part anticipation. I gestured him to go on, and he did. The doorway seekers, or just plain seekers, are kind of a satanic cult, dude. They, worship Satan? Scott shook his head. "No, these guys are different. They believe that in order for the world to keep on existing, there has to be some evil in it. They think that without evil to balance out the good, the world will be destroyed." My attention was his at this point. I still was sure he was screwing with me, but it was an interesting story. "They're called the Doorway Seekers because they're always looking for entrances into hell that are spread out all over the world. They use these doorways to release a calculated amount of evil into the world, just enough to keep the world in balance." He leaned in closer. "And one of those doorways is somewhere in that forest." I shuddered. Say what you will about Scott, that guy can tell one hell of a story. I looked toward the thicket of trees beyond the fence and noticed night was approaching. The thin space between the trees was pitch black, hiding an uncounted number of unnameable horrors. I went to take another sip of Pepsi, but noticed I'd bled my can dry. Chuckling, I put the can down. Scott must have noticed the awkwardness of my chuckle, because he eyed me with concern. "You all right?" he asked, his small hands crushing his own empty can. "Yeah," I said. The same awkward chuckle escaped my lips again. "That was some story." "Oh, that was no story," Scott said. "Another Pepsi?" I held my hand up like a criminal caught in the crosshairs of a determined cop. "Oh, no, no more for me. Any more of these and my teeth will fall out of my mouth." A silence followed, punctuated by the passing of a car on a distant main road. "Hey, Scott." "Yeah? Are there any seekers here in Oak Lake?" He thought for a moment before answering. "You know what?" he said. "I'm not really sure. I've never tried to verify Scott's story. Why bother? As far as I was concerned, the whole thing was an elaborate fiction. A good story to tell around the campfire to your friends. I certainly never asked my parents if they'd heard of the Doorway Seekers. I did not forget about the story, though, but I tried to put it out of my mind. I'd arrive home by early afternoon from swimming camp down at the middle school. I read books in my bedroom or watched whatever was on Cartoon Network to pass the time. When I looked toward the forest, all I saw was the gentle, lazy swaying of the branches and the play of light and dark between the leaves in the recesses of the forest. At night, however, Scott's story became a frightful focal point in my mind. There would be a faint rustling between the walls, or a dog barking in the distance, or my parents shuffling about the house, and I would think of hell and doorways. I'd look up from my book or from the television and stare out the window at the forest, its arms in the form of trunks and its fingers in the form of branches, reaching out from the darkness to grab me. Scott hadn't said much in his story at all, just that there was a doorway to hell in the forest behind my house. No gruesome details, no human sacrifice, no blood or guts. But that small story had been enough. For a boy with a wild imagination, it was enough. And that's why I don't know what compelled me to start going for walks in the forest. Maybe I wanted to prove Scott and my parents wrong. The forest wasn't dangerous. It wasn't evil. Or maybe I thirsted for an adventure like Captain Morgan in Cup of Gold. Or maybe I was just bored. I only went for walks during the day, tearing my clothes off after the bus dropped me off from swim camp. I'd squeeze into a fresh shirt, sweatpants, and secure lime green running shoes. I put on my Cubs baseball cap and grabbed my mom's sunglasses from her dresser. She wouldn't miss them. I also grabbed my father's hunting knife, just in case. That first time, I crept across the lawn to the fence that backed up for the first line of trees. I was afraid someone would see and tell my parents, ending my first act of rebellion before it even began. After removing the 2 loose planks from the fence, I crawled through the opening. There was no ceremony, no real threshold to cross besides the fence. The forest didn't seem as dense up close. Walking between the trees was surprisingly easy. My path was dark, the cover of the trees cast and almost total. However, an occasional opening allowed in a bullet of sunshine. The first bullet shocked my vision when I looked up. The world appeared black and white, devoid of all color, and I had to sit back down against the tree trunk in order to gain back my composure. I slipped my mother's sunglasses on my face, learning from my mistake. Lessons learned and repeat excursions led me to gather a measure of enjoyment from my walks. Every day I walked further and further in, retracing my steps around gnarled roots protruding from the earth, twigs that never seemed to be in the same arrangement twice, and changes in elevation as low as a stair or as high as my chest. I never encountered any animals on my walks. In fact, I found odd. There were no squirrels gathering nuts, no birds chirping their love songs overhead, not even insects to bite my flesh. As the days and weeks rolled along, this feature of the forest passed into normality, and walking with the sound of the wind as my only companion became the norm. I was always careful to keep my activities hidden. I left the house locked, the key looped through one of the laces of my shoes. I kept a strict eye on my watch and always put the 2 fence planks back to where they belonged. I was showered and dressed by the time my parents came home from work, with a thick novel resting on my thighs, the sound of Radiohead or Incubus softly pulsing from the CD player. I put the music on for my parents' comfort. It made them uneasy when they came home to a silent house, me perched on an easy chair, reading like I'd fussed with the furniture. I still hung out with Scott on occasion. Our schedules were mismatched, with him at football practice at the Park District, while I was out playing Magellan. I never told him about how I spent my afternoons, and he never asked. We didn't talk about the forest either, preferring to pass out evenings watching TV or playing board games. The walks started becoming activities I'd look forward to, and my traditional elation at weekends turned to anxious waiting for my parents to start work again. The forest had ceased to become sinister, the terror fading to a thin mist. It wasn't until late July that the terror returned. The night was a cool one, if my memory serves me right. I'd gone on my walk in the forest that afternoon, pushing further than I had on previous days. The walk was uneventful, banal even. As the sun set, my mind was deep in the world of Stephen King's Dark Tower series. Roland of Gilead was fighting for his life, being slowly eaten alive by strange lobster-like creatures. I had a habit of reading using the scant light of my bedside lamp. I was rubbing the strain out of my eyes when I heard a sound coming from the backyard. It sounded like someone had dropped a piece of wood. I stood up, stretched, and made my way to the window. From this second-story vantage point, I had a panoramic view of my backyard. It was dark, the only light spilling from the neighbors' yards on either side of us. My eyes scanned the darkness, panning back and forth, like a drunk man with an unsteady camera. They eventually focused on a sight they'd glazed over a moment before. In the back corner of the yard, 2 wooden fence planks lay against the fence proper, showing an opening into the forest beyond. My first reaction was surprise, followed by confusion, then followed by panic. I was sure I'd replaced the planks to their proper place when I'd reemerged from the woods. I'd done that very thing with religious devotion every day for weeks. Failure now seemed bizarre. I threw on a red sweater with the Statue of Liberty on the front and crept into my kitchen. I walked toward the sliding glass doors that led to the patio and lifted the blinds as quietly as I could. Staring, I remained motionless, listening for any sign that my parents had stirred. They'd not. My hand reached for the lock, but at that same moment my eye caught a flash of something to the left. At first I thought a fly had entered into my vision, but I was wrong. A crouched figure darted across the lawn. It looked at first like a large canvas sack of dirty laundry, rolling, pulsing blob in the night. I soon saw legs made out of torso and a head. Somebody was running towards the opening in the fence. I was motionless, my hand still reaching for the lock as I watched the figure disappear back into the forest. My terror was total now, and I even feared turning around. Had the figure seen me? Why did it run? Did my parents see it? After what felt like countless hours, but was perhaps only a few minutes, I turned and ran up the stairs, not caring if I woke anyone. I bolted into my room and jumped underneath the covers, with my heart pounding in my chest like a frantic caged bird. I don't recall when I fell asleep that night. The next morning I awoke, blissfully unaware of anything except the weight of my own body. I blinked several times, and the previous night's horror crept back into my mind. Some dream, I thought as I stretched out in front of my full-length mirror. I must have fallen asleep reading again. I really should. The thought was interrupted by the sight of what I wore. A red pullover hoodie with a circular logo bearing the Statue of Liberty stared back in the reflection of my mirror. The realization that the previous night's events had not been a dream drew me to my window. I remembered with stark clarity the dark, crouching figure running along the lawn toward the opening in the fence. The opening. I ran to my window. The opening was gone. Where the improvised doorway had once been was now occupied by 2 wooden planks set neatly into the frame. Whoever had been there last night had replaced the boards. I shuddered, pulled the loathsome hoodie over my head, and tossed it in the corner. It was Saturday, and I didn't need a calendar to tell me that. My mother's cooking odors wafted into my room, a siren song that would doom my hunger. I ran down the stairs as any middle schooler would at the smell of his mother's cooking. I smelled eggs, I smelled bacon, and I smelled coffee. Though I didn't drink coffee, I found the smell relaxing. "Good morning," my mother said. She was a tall, thin woman, brown hair resting lightly on her head in full curls. She was wearing a white apron with blue trim, a faded bear in the front. The bear was anthropomorphized to look like a patient mother, with a bonnet, glasses, and a rolling pin in one paw. There were letters beneath the image, but they were either too faded to read or too unimportant to remember. I was about to return the greeting when I noticed the sliding doors. The blinds were lowered, but rotated at an angle to allow sunlight to spill into the kitchen. Had I lowered them the previous night? "Oh, silly boy," my mom said, noticing my transfixed gaze. You forgot to close the blinds last night. Your father lowered them this morning." My father? Did my father also put the planks back in the fence this morning? I gazed up at my mother. She was smiling at me, so I smiled back. There was no indication that she knew about the fence. No worry in her face, no reluctant questions about if I'd been in the backyard messing around. My mother's calm had the opposite effect on me, however. My stomach sank into my bowels. She didn't know about the fence. That meant someone was in my backyard last night, and that someone had closed off the fence. I didn't go on my walk the following Monday. Breaking this steadfast ritual felt odd at best, and blasphemous at worst, but my fear won out in the end. The afternoon after swimming camp was spent in front of the TV with little attention paid to what was on. Scott's odd story about cults and the doorways to hell started creeping in again. It had been months since he had told me the story, and the details were murky. Grasping at them was like trying to see underwater without any goggles on. What had the cult been called? The doorway what? Finders? Keepers? Jeepers? Creepers? Whatever they were called didn't matter to me at that moment. What mattered was what they did. They're looking for entrances to hell, Scott had said. They use these doorways to release a calculated amount of evil into the world. I sat in front of the TV all day. When my parents came home, they remarked at how I wasn't reading. I hadn't felt like reading that day. When Scott called, I told him I wasn't feeling well. I went to bed early. The next few days were the same. I woke up, went to my swimming classes, rode the bus home, showered, sat in front of the TV. I rarely read. When I tried, I would retreat as soon as I got engrossed in the narrative. Why try and get involved with a nuanced universe when you were so preoccupied with your own? My parents offered the standard questions about my health. Why wasn't I eating? Was I having trouble sleeping? Why had I been in the same place in my book all week? I gave non-committal answers, and they left me alone. They had no idea that I was saving energy, mentally preparing myself. I decided on Friday, 1 week after the incident in the backyard, to resume my walk. I started off as I had before, changing into my t-shirt, shorts, Cubs cap, and lime green running shoes, and removing the 2 planks from the fence with the care one uses when handling infants. The space before me seemed darker somehow, as if it were much later than 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I raised my sunglasses and lowered them several times, gauging the light. After a moment's consideration, I draped the sunglasses from my shirt collar. I wouldn't need them today. As long as I remained smart about where I looked, I would not be blinded by any sunlight. I retraced my steps, walking around twigs and roots, twisting around tree trunks and measuring my steps. In all of my weeks of walking, I had made it further each time, passing another set of trees here, marking a wide opening there, and mentally tracking my stopping point every time. My memory was surprisingly good here, and I was always sure I was taking the same route. Today felt no different. It was as if I hadn't skipped a day. As a result, I went further than I ever had before. My progress was alarming. It was electric. I knew it was because my body was making up for lost time. I was barely aware I was doing this, barely aware that I'd been wound back like a spring and let go. I passed my last stopping point, noting the sun in the sky with a quick glance upwards. There was still time before the light made its departure, and I was determined to use every second. I'd left a scratch mark on the trunk of a tree to denote my stopping point the previous week using my father's knife. I kept walking. My legs felt Olympian. I listened for any noises that weren't the crunch of my feet on leaves, or my breath escaping my lungs. I heard nothing. Not a bird singing its evening song, not a mosquito buzzing in search of blood. The silence was to be expected, but the gulf of time between my last walk and today meant I now noticed it anew, and it unnerved me. Where weren't the birds chirping? Why, in all my excursions into the forest, had I never returned covered in itchy, reddening mosquito bites? There was nothing alive here, besides the trees, deep in the forest, behind my house. I was walking in a land devoid of any animal life. An odd loneliness filled me. My walking slowed as I looked at my watch. The digital display said 3:45. The sun usually set at 8 this time of year, but I knew my parents would be home around 7 p.m. I made my way back, my pace quick. A disquieting feeling entered my mind. The magic wonder I felt on those walks was gone. The figure in my backyard stole that feeling from me. Before, I felt like Bilbo Baggins going on an adventure. Now, I felt like I was running away from something. There was now a feeling of finality to it all, a curtain closing at the end of the best play in the world. My pace slowed as fatigue set in my muscles. I glanced at my watch. 4:57 p.m. By my estimation, I was still 2 hours away from home. I'd be cutting it close to my parents' arrival. I sighed and kept on marching. It was around 6 o'clock when I heard the sound. It was a faraway sound, innocuous and innocent in any other context. In the confines of a silent forest, it was sharp and ominous. Someone was whistling. It was a few seconds before I stopped. Frozen, I strained to hear the odd music and pinpoint its origin. I closed my eyes, having seen this done in countless movies. There. The whistling was coming from the darker part of the forest in the east, adjacent to my path home. Great. I looked at my watch. 6:15. It was starting to get darker. I was going to be late. Without a second thought, I darted toward the sound of the whistling. I already had an excuse in mind when my parents came home. I'd tell them I was grabbing a ball that flew over the fence. When I came back empty-handed, I'd say it must have flown into the forest. I smiled at my own cleverness. Almost as soon as I started walking east, I felt the growing darkness on my body as if it were a physical substance. I tried not to shudder, but an involuntary spasm rippled through me. I can't recall if I was fearful or if I was just excited. The whistling continued, a pleasant tune I did not recognize, that was high in pitch. It sounded like a sea shanty or a working song that I'd heard in some place or other. It got louder as I got closer. I felt a rush of heat all over my body. Nerves, I guess. I hadn't encountered another person in these woods before, and I was wary of what I would see. Yet, as I crouched from tree to tree, my confidence grew. I walked carefully, making little noise. I hid behind the wide trunks of trees I passed, careful to stay out of sight of anything ahead of me. I encountered the man suddenly, but because of the care of my approach, I was able to dart behind a wide elm. When I peered around the trunk, I found that I needn't have been worried. The man had his back to me. He was seated, still whistling the same sea shanty, its pleasant melody a stark contrast to my state of excited apprehension. He appeared to be tall and thin, hunched over so his vertebrae made a mountain range up the middle of his back. His black t-shirt was clean, but full of small holes like pitted asphalt. His dark hair was askew, and I could see that his pale skin was contrasting his dark clothing. It all seemed wrong when I stopped to think about it. It wasn't just the fact that I was surreptitiously watching another person without their knowledge. It was also that I couldn't think of a good reason why this man would be in this part of the forest. There wasn't another house close by, though I'm sure he could have just been on a leisurely stroll like me. But that also felt wrong. Call it a hunch, but I had the distinct impression that this man had come from deeper in the forest. I didn't know how far back the forest went, but this man had to have walked a great distance to get where he sat. I was interrupted in my thoughts by a change. The man had stopped whistling. My body tensed. Why had I not been paying attention? I was sure the man was going to turn around, gaze in my direction, and grin an evil grin. I was sure that if he did, I'd be frozen in my spot, unable to run. The man did indeed stand up, a deep grunt escaping his lips. I held my breath. The gaunt man, however, did not turn around. He brushed at his pants and started walking away from me, never looking over his shoulder. He resumed whistling, but this tune was different and less cheerful. Only when he had gone 20 feet or so did I allow myself to breathe again. The wind whistled through the trees, shaking branches, and leaving behind a calming soundtrack to my nervousness. I peered at the man. He seemed to be ambling along without haste. I could still see his form, though in a few seconds he would be obscured by the thickest of trees in front of him. I had to make a decision then. I seemed to be making a lot of those that day. I glanced at my watch, 6:25 p.m. Had I really been watching this man for almost 10 minutes? It seemed as if no time had passed at all. To this day, I don't know what made me follow him. Even now, many years later, I think about the consequences of that decision. How did I think this was going to turn out? Following a man alone in the woods is never an idea born of innocent curiosity. But follow the man I did. I slipped from behind the tree and made my way to the spot where the man had been sitting. The area had been cleared for some unknown purpose many years back. There were no fallen trees or natural rocks in this space. There was just a handful of native weeds and a large root of a nearby tree jutting out of the ground like a gnarled tooth. It was on this root the man had been sitting. I flitted from tree to tree, feeling like James Bond on a secret mission. The excitement of adventure filled me again. I felt like a character in a story, not a young boy who may have been on his way to encounter real horror. I kept the man in sight, using the sound of his walking to mask my own subtle footfalls. I dared not look away from him. I scarcely blinked, my concentration causing the edges of my vision to become clouded. I almost missed the man sidestep behind a tree. At that same moment, my foot kicked something painfully. I bit my lip to stop from crying out and looked down to see what I'd run into. A large stone was on the ground. It looked as if it had been placed there. I darted my eyes to the left and to my right and had my suspicions confirmed. There were dozens of stones laid in a curve on the ground a foot apart. I appeared to be standing on the outer rim of a stone circle. This didn't unnerve me until I walked forward to the tree, where I saw the gaunt man disappear. It was there I encountered another stone circle. The stones were the same size and spaced apart the same as the others. I looked from behind the tree and saw the man I'd followed. His back was to me again, only this time there were two other figures standing beside him. One was the same height as the gaunt man, also wearing a black t-shirt and dark pants. The second man was larger than the first, his features round. The third figure was a short, petite woman whose hair was hidden underneath a black ski cap. She was also wearing a black t-shirt and black jeans. They'd already started speaking, but my timing was perfect. "So, we're ready then?" the larger man said. His voice seemed to be filled with impatience. Yes, said the gaunt man in a placating tone. "Okay, The large man let out a deep sigh. "Afraid, Baxter?" the woman said, her voice oddly soft and sweet given her manner of dress. The large man, Baxter, huffed. "Have you ever known me to be afraid, Kel?" Kel smiled. "No, but you seem nervous." "Well, I haven't seen the offering yet." "You'll be seeing the offering tonight," the gaunt man said. I had no idea what they were talking about, but I felt uneasy. Their tone was strained, nervous. They seemed to have a great task ahead of them. Kel spoke again. "I hope this time you picked an offering that won't squirm too much." The gaunt man turned toward the woman, putting him in profile. A small smile curled his lips. "This one won't squirm. Trust me. He's a bit athletic, but I brought something special to make sure he doesn't run away." "A paralytic?" Baxter asked. "A paralytic." They all nodded significantly, as if this word was a prayer. My feelings of unease grew. I reached toward my belt to grab my knife in order to defend myself. From what, I did not know. "Listen up, Bax and Kel," the gaunt man said. I knew authority when I heard it. If this is to go off without a hitch, we must all be on time. Again, significant nods. My fingers wrapped around the hilt of my father's knife, slowly pulling it from the sheath. "Please alert all of the other seekers and make sure they get the message." My breath caught at the familiar word. Seekers. My chest felt tight, and my muscles failed me. My hand, reaching for the knife, stumbled, and the weapon slipped from my grasp. My panic barely had time to register before I heard the sound of metal on stone. The knife bounced off one of the stones in the circle at my feet and fell into the dirt. I did not waste a second. I turned and ran in the direction I'd come, careful not to stumble over the outer stone circle. I didn't look to see if the 3 doorway seekers had seen me. I did not grieve for the knife I'd dropped. I simply ran. I didn't stop until I reached my fence. I didn't know how long it took or what the distance was, but dark was overtaking light when I replaced the fence planks and ran into the house. I checked the time on the microwave. 7:24 p.m. I stood in the kitchen, ears straining for the sounds that I expected. My parents yelling, stamping on the stairs, rustling in the rooms upstairs. I heard nothing. My parents were not home yet. It was unexpected, but not worrying. I went to the phone and sure enough found the red light for new message blinking. I pressed play on the answering machine and heard the familiar sound of my mother. Her voice comforted me. "Hi there, sweetie. Your father and I ran into a few old friends in the city and decided to have dinner with them. We most likely will not be home until late. I'm sorry to have missed you and sorry to spring this on you, but you can watch whatever you want on TV and eat the leftover lasagna that's in the fridge. Please use the microwave and not the oven, please. Love you and see you tonight." The message ended. I stared at the answering machine for some time, unable to decide if I was lucky or unlucky. I decided to take my mother's advice to heat up the lasagna. I brought a heaping portion on a plate, a large plate, into the living room and settled in front of the TV. But I couldn't keep focused. Everything about the day's strange events was running through my head. I was no longer frightened, but I still felt a nervous energy in the air. Eventually, the combination of food, the drone of the television, and my ceaseless running in the summer sun caused me to drift off to sleep. I don't know how long I was out when I heard the noise. I must have thought it was from my dream, for I don't remember stirring. I only jerked awake when I felt the gloved hand cover my mouth. My eyes burst open, only to face a darkened living room full of 3 silhouettes of 3 people. One of these people had covered my mouth and was standing to my left. I was pulled off the couch by a 4th person I couldn't see, who proceeded to grab me in a bear hug from behind to stop me from squirming. A burning hot lance of fear consumed my body, and my eyes became wild. I attempted to scream, but the hand over my mouth pressed harder. I attempted to bite the hand, but only caught bits of the fabric in my teeth. "Grab him," said a cruel voice, muffled by what was probably a mask. The hand over my mouth was gone, and a damp cloth was stuffed in my mouth with startling quickness. I didn't have time to scream. The effects of whatever they had soaked the rag with were immediate. I felt my mouth grow numb. My fingers, toes, and other extremities started to tingle. It was like when I got my tooth pulled at the dentist. I wasn't entirely sure, but I think the grip of the fourth captor loosened slightly. I could still see, though my vision was starting to blur. I was moving. They were carrying me out of the house. How had they even gotten in? My mind raced with harried thoughts of escape. I was led out of the sliding glass doors of my kitchen across the lawn. The fence planks had been removed and were propped against the fence. I was roughly pushed through. The evident leader of the group seemed to be barking orders, but I don't remember what he said. My fear was total. I'd become paralyzed by both it and by whatever they had put in the rag in my mouth. Soon thoughts of escape changed to thoughts of sleep. If only I could fall unconscious. Maybe then I could wake from this nightmare back in the safety of my bed. Every time I closed my eyes, something jolted them open again. I was either pushed, tripped over a snarling root, or heard a loud barking order from the leader. It didn't take long to find the stone circle. Even in the darkness, and in my altered state, I could tell where we were going. Through my haze, I could hear voices. They didn't conceal their movements or lower their voices. They didn't care who heard. There was no one around to hear them. The mass of people tightened into a circle. Someone struck something, and a whoosh sounded into the night air. A column of flame soon followed, and I could see everyone now in the harsh firelight, their silhouettes like black columns holding up a church of evil. The fire brought a strange clarity to the events, and my fear returned in equal measure to the increasing light. The silhouettes swayed in unison, and faint chants in a language I could not recognize reached my ears. Their volume increased as their swaying exaggerated. The shadows seemed to blend together, the black mass becoming one. The flames danced as well to their chanting in what looked like a drunken swagger. Above all of this, one voice was louder than the others. It was a deep voice, oddly familiar in the unfamiliar space. "And we who shall bear this sacrifice with our own souls," said the voice. At times chanting drowned out parts of the speech, and I had to strain to hear what was being said. "To these depths do we enter." I closed my eyes tight, not wanting to see the light. "For we shall make good what has been made bad." This meandering speech continued for some time, and I'm not entirely sure when it ceased. There was a painful silence, heavy in the night air. Finally, the booming voice spoke again. "Where is the innocent blood?" At the moment those words escaped his lips, my captors hauled me upright and pushed me forward toward the roaring fire. I felt the increased heat as the chanting of the shadowed forms around me increased in speed and volume. They seemed more harried and insistent. When I was at last forced to stop, I was a mere 6 inches from the edge of the fire, which I now noticed was coming from a deep pit. I was swaying dangerously, but my captors held fast to my arms. "You've done well," said the man who spoke earlier. That baritone was familiar in my ears, and in that moment I felt sure I knew who it was. I lifted my head, a Herculean effort. When I gazed on the hooded face above me, I gasped, though it came out more like a muffled, wet gurgle. It was Mr. Coil, my friend Scott's father. I attempted to jerk away from my captors so I could scan the rest of the faces in the stone circle. I needed to know if Scott was among them, but I was weak and my attempt was stopped by strong hands grasping me. Mr. Cole's face remained impassive. He did not speak, though the chanting around me became more insistent. I wanted to ask Mr. Cole why he was doing this. I wanted to beg for help or offer a plea to let me go. He must have seen something on my face, for he lifted his finger to his lips as if shushing a small child. Was he trying to tell me to keep quiet? Or was he trying to tell me this was our little secret? A faint smile curved on the old man's face, and a new terror gripped me. The new terror was multiplied tenfold when he produced a knife from his belt. It was a black blade, its edge gleaming in the firelight. His hand clutched the handle with such vigor that I thought it would snap in half. I wish it had. I wished the knife had broken into 1,000,000 shards, piercing his hand with 1,000,000 little cuts. But I was not that lucky. Mr. Cole raised the knife overhead as if it were a trophy. "Is this the knife of truth?" he called, his voice thundering off the trees. "Indeed it is," chorused the circle of dark shapes. "Then we shall administer the test," he said. He lowered his hands and stepped towards me. My body tensed and the grip on my arms tightened in anticipation. His arm shot out expertly, almost too fast to see. I felt a prick on my triceps and hot liquid trickled down my arm. The pain did not come until I was dragged closer to the pit, with my arm jerked violently over the fire. I could see blood running in a slow trickle into the pit, drops coalescing, then dripping like a leaky faucet. I bit down against the pain and revulsion, tasting the foul rag still stuffed in my mouth. The chanting around me resumed in a wave, the violence of their voices pressing against my body like an oppressive wind. I had given up fighting. I felt too weak. The air around me began to change. My face began to feel cold despite my proximity to the fire. The wind started to blow in the still night, the swaying branches and dancing leaves seeming to applaud this horrendous display. The earth became unsteady beneath my feet, but I was held fast and did not pitch forward. The fire in front of me began to change color. I saw a flash of pink, then white smoke began to emerge from the pit, flowing of its own accord. The smoke came in several jets, each stream timed to the rhythm of my heart. Next came a scream, one that emerged from below. My bones rattled at the sound. The flames and white smoke shot further into the air. The bellowing kept on, unabated, unceasing in its terrifying triumph. Everybody reacted, though not in surprise like I had. They were whispering fervently, though I could hear fear and hesitation in their reverie. The grip on me loosened, but I was too weak to break away. Mr. Cole had not put away his knife. He had not even relaxed his grip. Though he wasn't looking at me, he was still poised for some action. It was then I knew that Mr. Cole meant to kill me. He meant to permanently silence me, complete his ritual, and then go back to his wife and Scott. My parents would never know of my fate. They would never know what happened to their only son. This thought galvanized me, though I didn't react right away. To do so would play my hand too soon. His hands, gripping me, loosened once more. I waited. My captors were getting careless. When the grip had loosened enough, I bent my injured arm at the elbow, ignoring the pain. I removed the wet gag from my mouth and spat. My head instantly cleared. I spat again for good measure and looked up at Mr. Cole. The old man was not looking at me, his gaze transfixed by the white smoke still shooting out from the pit like ghostly bullets. I brought my arm down and clenched my fist. My arms were still in my captor's grip, but I was not stopped. With a final effort and a grunt, I wrenched my flexed arm free from my captor and shot my elbow back. It made contact. I felt soft flesh and heard a grunt. I spun away from my second captor, who let go of me with a surprising lack of resistance. Surprise was on my side. The momentum of the chanting circle was broken, their congruous effort faltering. It was all the distraction I needed. Without looking for obstacles, I ran toward the circle of revelers, pushing past two who had swayed in opposite directions. The opening they provided was enough for me to squeeze through, and I was off in the forest before they had a chance to assemble. I ran blindly, not caring where I was headed. Behind me I could hear cries of surprise, alarm, and anger chasing me. The noise began to recede, and the desperate sound of my footsteps became the only soundtrack to my escape. The doorway seekers had many advantages on me. There were more of them, they were all faster, and they had anger on their side. I, however, knew that forest. Oh, how I knew that forest. My countless explorations had created a mental map that I now accessed. My eyes adjusted to the dark as I dodged obstacles like an acrobat. I darted in and out of trees and ducked beneath low-hanging branches that reached down like the arms of giants. I didn't keep track of the time, but it felt both too soon and too late when I reached my house. I replaced the fence planks in their proper spot once I was in the backyard. Though I could not hear the sounds of pursuit, I was frantic in my flight to the house. I opened the screen door and charged into the kitchen. I was on the phone with the police in no time at all. 911, what's your emergency? The stale voice in the line said. I told her my emergency. She sounded bored as she took down the details and my address. She told me a patrol car would be around the corner shortly. I didn't have to wait long. When a frantic child in my neighborhood called the police to say he was home alone and the thought intruders were breaking into his house, the police showed up fast. My parents arrived 40 minutes after the police. With them present, I made a statement. My parents and the police asked how I'd injured my arm. I told them I was roughhousing with Scott and I hurt myself. They called Scott's house and his father answered, corroborating my story. I had a feeling this would be the case, but I understand how big of a risk that was to take. The police, nor my parents, nor Mr. Cole's false confirmation of my whereabouts did anything to ease my nerves. I still felt an incessant dread, a bottomless darkness that I could not shake. I thought at the time it might have been shock from the events that night. I had no idea how wrong I was. I never saw my friend Scott again. Since there was no final meeting, no last hurrah, I can't pinpoint the last time I saw him or what we did. After the events of that summer night, Scott stopped answering his phone. Nobody ever returned my calls, and any attempt I made at visiting his house was met with silence. It was as if they'd packed up for an extended vacation without bothering to tell anyone when they were coming back. My parents showed concern for both the flight of the Coles and my change in behavior. They tried tracking down the missing family, but it all came to nothing. They were worried about my sudden night terrors, attributing it to PTSD from the fake break-in attempt I'd experienced. I can't remember what I dreamt on those nights, but I do remember always waking up with the same feeling of dread I felt that night in the forest. I started to believe that I had erred in some way, that evil was thick in the air due to me. It was obvious that I had ruined the ritual of the doorway seekers. Scott had said that the seekers released a calculated amount of evil into the world through doorways to hell. Had I upset that balance somehow? My theory was confirmed over the next few years. All over the world, tragedy begat tragedy. 4 months after my run-in with the Seekers, my parents were gunned down in a massacre at the local mall that claimed 150 lives. Crime rose by 40% every year thereafter globally. Countries followed Syria and Somalia's fate, descending into civil war resulting in collapsed central governments. Oil-rich nations became resource deserts, causing a global financial recession. Now, more than ever, the crimes of the rich, the powerful, and the political elite went unpunished. Police forces had more unsolved cases on their books than ever before. A collision of two satellites in orbit had caused an ocean of space debris to rain down on the planet, knocking out communications and costing an untold number of lives. The United States, Canada, and Western Europe had gone on purges, ridding their population of undesirables and refugees in order to concentrate their resources. Preachers around the world prophesied this as the end of days. We were being punished by God, they said. Others said that the devil had found his way to earth. The rationalists in the world attributed these events to simple entropy. Civilization, given enough time, would always trend toward collapse. I, however, was one of the few in the world who knew the truth. I had upset a balance that night in the forest. I'd stopped what was necessary in order to curb this evil. It took me a while to accept this notion, but once I did, I knew what had to be done. The ritual must be complete. The doorway must be sealed. I am the only one who can do it. I must head back into the forest.
Chilling tales for dark nights.